Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're back. So good to see so many of you here in the chat with us. I'm back today with JC, or J. Corman Kane. We're going to be talking about how the Muhammad myth was created. He's an author. He's written 2 books on Islam. We'll post these links a little bit later. And he's been looking at the Islamic narrative and how, as an author, would you create this Islamic narrative, taking facts, fiction, blending them, and creating this really interesting tale that we call the standard Islamic narrative. Mal is supposed to join us. I'm not sure where he is, and Odon is a few minutes late. He'll join in a minute or 2. So yeah, JC, welcome back, and hello everyone, and welcome Lolo. Always great to see you. Where is Lolo's message? There we go. So thank you, Lo. Welcome back, and JC, welcome.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me over, and hello, everybody. Today, we are going to be doing part 2 of what we started last time with Odon, and it's going to be a little bit different. Instead of going through characters, we're going to start taking in more of the actual history, but we're going to always give it the spin of what the traditions say, and so on. I have a couple of things that we're going to discuss today, which I haven't really seen being discussed out there. So hopefully it will blow people's minds, or they will at least trigger them to actually ask questions. And I will start sharing in a moment. Probably I will start actually saying some things before Odon gets here and says, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong.
Yeah, I was very worried about that myself, trust me. Odon also knows a great deal, So yeah, but he'll be on in like just a minute or 2, he told me. So he's just getting his laptop booted up. He was running late to get home. Yeah, but he'll be here shortly. So do you just want to give us a brief catch-up of what you did last time so that the audience knows what it was we did previously?
Yeah, well, last time we looked at how the story was actually formed from character point of view. So Mohammed didn't exist, but the stories couldn't simply just be fabricated. It is almost impossible to create something from scratch. So they would have taken stories from people like Umar, from Salman the Persian, and then based on that, in the end, they say, okay, well, we need to create a prophet. And what did this prophet do? Well, I don't know, let's have a look at what those guys did, and we create the story in that manner. So in short, that's actually what we did. The process is like what the historians do, but like, for example, if we try to unpick where the legend of King Arthur came from, probably you would think, okay, well, King Arthur, hi, Odon, welcome.
Hello, Lloyd, JC.
Welcome, Odon. Hi. How is your new place?
I hear you fine. Put some volume.
We hear you just fine.
No, I don't hear a thing. It's strange.
Okay. We hear you. You're good.
Yeah.
But I don't hear you. Just checking the speaker.
Okay, testing. One.
Wrong speaker. Okay.
Wrong speaker. Okay.
No.
Well.
Okay. Now I'm hearing. Now I'm hearing you.
Hello, Odon. How are you?
Oh, I'm okay now. I was a bit in a rush to join you, but now it's all right.
We waited a few minutes, and so we gave it a few minutes of delay, and then JC was just giving us an update on what we covered previously, how the narrative was created. But before we go back to JC, how's your new place, Odon? How are things in the new accommodation?
Just have a look. This is my soon-to-be study, but
nice.
It's not completely installed yet.
It's bigger than my whole apartment, Odon.
Yeah, I've got the whole apartment, exactly, and I've got a study or an office, which is something really nice. But there's so much to do. I haven't unpacked all my books, and but at least internet is working. Yeah, I'm able to work. I've already released a video on my French channel, for example. and I will do more videos on my French and English channel. Yeah, it's nice. It's nice. And I have a huge room, a huge bedroom under the roof.
Very nice.
With the roof like this. No, it's nice.
Very nice to hear.
Really nice.
Yeah.
Glad to hear.
Okay. Yeah. So JC, do you want to give us again that brief catch up? And Odon, I believe, has some familiarity with it.
Well, yeah, last time we spoke about characters and how those
Yeah.
people, according to their own traditions, they probably they were used in order to create the stuff, the myth of Mohammed. And yes, as an example, is if, for example, you tried to unpick the legend of King Arthur, you would know, okay, well, a guy who was not a king, and then something happens with a sword, and then he becomes the king. So, well, would there have been anybody who was not a king, and then maybe he was a warrior, and because of that he becomes a king, and then you look for people in history who would fit that sort of description, and then join the dots. So it's pretty much looking at the what their actual myth says about things, and then say, okay, is there anything in history that could have made them copy and then create the narrative in that manner? And that's what we did with characters, and today we're going to do that with other things. Some things I have now seen in Odon's book, which is absolutely phenomenal, and anyone who hasn't read it yet and is interested in Islam, they should, because it's a full blueprint of what happened with Islam. And it really answered a few questions that were really annoying me, like, why did this thing happen in that manner? And then I read the book and it's there exactly. So thank you for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna
You'll be talking about the story of Alexander the Great and Zulkarnain and such things like this, maybe?
No, instead of actually going through the actual stories, what we're going to do, actually, shall I start sharing the slides, and then I can go through the things
let
we're
me
going to
take
discuss?
one moment to just go off topic. I want to show the audience something I discovered yesterday, which so everyone, I've been doing some reading of my favorite theologian, the world's greatest theologian, the man called Martin Lucifer, or Martin Lucifer. And he writes this in Luther's works. Then he says here, as you can see, he's writing about Jesus, and he says Jesus will not judge anyone. Jesus does not judge anyone. Jesus will not judge anyone. Jesus is not a judge. He then says Jesus is a judge. Jesus will judge you, but Jesus is not a judge. Jesus will never judge you. So whatever, we'll make sense of that another time. But then he says randomly in the middle of it, he goes, then also Mary's help was invoked, who was to show Christ her breasts as a reminder. Now, I suspect that is the missing verse in Luther's Bible, which is the show me your boobies verse, which was eaten by a goat.
Oh, no, but Lloyd, you have to refer to the context. Without the context, you cannot say anything about this. It might be completely candid and innocent.
So, guys, as you know, I am doing an entire series on Luther. I have 335 slides in my presentation. I'd like to wrap it up at this point. So hopefully the next couple of months, I will do all of them without adding more material. I think I've done that job. And so, yeah, more Luther coming up. And so there's not only the standard Islamic narrative, there's the standard Lutheran narrative, which is just as false. Why he would say something like this, heaven alone knows. I certainly don't, but this is written in Luther's works in volume 23, page 335. If anyone knows why he would say something like this, please do let me know. And now back to our regular scheduled broadcast. Thank you.
Okay, so from some very weird verses to other very weird verses, let me share the screen, and then we can take it from there.
Yeah, I have no idea what to make. Seriously, when I read Muhammad, I read the Quran, it drives my brain wants to break. I seriously get fractures in my brain. And I read Luther, and I get exactly the same experience. It's crazy.
Okay, let's see. Can you guys see my screen all white?
It is. You can click the little thingy that says hide over there on the bottom, that little stop sharing hide thingy. Yep, that's it.
All right. So great. So let's see what we are going to see today. First, we're going to just have a look at a couple of maps where we're going to plot some of the information that we know, but just to visualize a little bit of what was going on the maps with the standard Islamic narrative and the Qibla walls and these sort of things very, very quickly, almost like a warm-up. Then a little hypothesis as to how the whole thing with the Hijra and the Qibla direction happened. Then some of the misreadings of the Quran, although if we're running out of time, maybe I will skip that one because a lot of it is as well. I have found it in Odon's book and it's actually starting to become mainstream. More people are talking about this. So maybe we will talk a little bit or maybe we just skip it.
Okay. Then
something hopefully very interesting. So as we know, there were lots and lots of Qurans. And then there was a canonization, and we are stuck with the Quran that we have now, plus the 7 billion qira'ats, but one rasam. But before that, there were many different Qurans, and they have been all basically destroyed. Well, we're going to look at some of those. We're going to look certainly at one, possibly two, and maybe even three different Qurans from back in the day before they were completely removed from history, and we will have an idea of what they look like. So hopefully that will be interesting. And then we are going to discuss a little bit about the Southern hypothesis. There are quite a few things in the traditions that they point towards the South, not in the early time of Islam, but a little bit later on that actually shaped what the Islam that we have now. And I'm going to actually show why I think how that happened and why, and hopefully it will be very clear. So in short, that's what we're going to cover today. How does it sound?
Marvelous.
Sorry.
Great. So let's get started. The first is this. I actually like this meme, and I actually can imagine Odon trying to write his book like that, but with a pipe instead of a cigarette.
Something like that, but
yeah, it's just so true. Well, let's see if we can actually join some of these red lines with some important dots. Very quickly on the northern thesis or the Petra thesis. Well, this is the same slide that I showed as well last time. The standard Islamic narrative says that everything starts there in Yathrib, and within 40 years, they conquer all of that. So that's not a map of just some guys that are caravan traders and then they decide to go and build an empire. This is a map of elite military. These people know exactly what they were doing and they played the game extraordinarily well. This is not even just Saracens who say, hey, let's actually do one alliance at a time. We betray them later and let's see where we get to. These people knew what they were doing. So it's the backdrop of all of this is they wanted to conquer land and that they did. So when we look at the standard Islamic narrative, it says that Mecca is right there and it was, very, very heavily fortified. So in order for Mohammed to conquer Mecca, he needs to conquer a little bit of land and strengthen his armies. So he conquered that land, pretty much. So we see it's obviously like a problem. Mecca, we also know that it didn't really exist. It would have been a tiny village, like 3 guys on a camel. They would have a steamroll over Mecca on day one unless it was so small that they didn't even know there was a Mecca. So the standard Islamic narrative says there was a battle there in Hijra. Then is when they went and they conquered Mecca. And then they went and they conquered Tabuk and the Battle of Tabuk. Now, we know that Mecca wasn't there, that didn't happen. But the next
you're
one,
breaking up. Just hold on, pause a second. You're breaking up very badly, JC.
Okay, testing. Hello.
It's like you're underwater.
My back.
it's okay with me. The sound
Oh,
is
really?
good.
Unless it's on my side. But
Okay, Odon, could you hear me before?
Yeah, I heard you
Okay.
loud and clear.
okay, just continue. Just continue.
Okay.
It could just be on my side that I'm hearing.
So, Petra. So, according to the standard Islamic narrative, it is Hijra, Mecca, and then Tabuk. but Mecca wasn't really there. So that is the Dan Gibson thesis, which is absolutely phenomenal. And the way that he describes that the traditions say how Mecca fell, and it is exactly a description of Petra. So we know that Mecca wasn't there, and the actual story that is being told was about Petra. Now, I do try to give the benefit of the doubt to people who wrote these things back in the day, but on Petra, certainly I'm not. Petra was expunged from the records. That city was a very beautiful city, very ancient city, the center of absolutely everything. And they were praying in that direction for over 100 years. And then when they write stuff 100 years later, they forgot about it. It's like these people knew that Petra was where everything started, but the city had already just been abandoned pretty much. So how can they say, our holy city is that one that is now in ruins? Everybody would think, maybe we're the bad guys and God is punishing us. So they create another one. The whole thing with Petra, it's not a mistake that is not in the records, but it's been expunged very thoroughly until Dan Gibson, which is phenomenal. Would you agree with that?
I mean, it's feasible. I think we know that records, places have been buried. They now are starting to uncover in Arabia. They're uncovering temples, monasteries, Christian places that were buried under sand. The Church of the Kathisma and so on and others, they're now discovering these things. So, and also we know that there were statues, there were rocks with inscriptions that have all disappeared or been blown up. So it's not without, and in fact, in 2015, an F-16 took out the major pagan museum in Yemen, which had a lot of ancient Arab history. So yeah, I mean, these are, I think, yeah, there's precedent for it.
Well, it's just a coincidence. It's just Allah works in mysterious ways to destroy evidence of all of this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't fully agree on the Petra thesis, but you know it already, JC. You read my book.
Yeah.
When you really look into Dan Gibson's discoveries, actually, he didn't find that all mosques and all buildings were directed toward Petra for 100 years, but only something like maybe 30% of those he studied. And some mosques and buildings were oriented elsewhere. So what one can say with this in mind is only that some factions or some Arabs had a devotion towards Petra, but not all Arabs, not all the concurrent Arabs, only some of them.
Right.
Yeah.
And there is another point in I want to make here about Dan Gibson Petra thesis, is that he conveniently swaps Mecca for Petra. He sort of abides by the Islamic narrative, asserting there is a unique place of origins for Islam, but the Muslim narrative made a mistake. And should we just change Mecca with Petra, everything would fit? Actually, it does not fit.
Yeah, I was about to say, yeah.
Fit. There are many things that don't work in a scenario.
Yeah, with Petra, for quite a while, I have thought that these people, they didn't really have a history. So they say they didn't have a prophet, so they created one by borrowing from different characters, including Jesus. Yeah. They didn't have a book, so they borrowed from other sources. With the same with Mecca. The moment that they had to create their holy city, they have to borrow from other cities. So they put stories from Petra, Jerusalem, Yemen, probably Tokyo.
I'd agree with you, because these guys are not looking to follow the rules strictly. They're looking to make things up to suit their preferences and agenda. If I can just show something for a moment, for instance, in Yemen, when we look at the one location in Yemen that I've covered before, it was called Makoraba. That also fits the same. It has the same characteristics as was attributed to Mecca, which Dan Gibson says he found in Petra. That's the same characteristics. It's green, it's got valleys, it's got all of the same agricultural activity. So it also fits that mold. It fits all the criteria applied to Mecca, which Dan Gibson said was Petra. So it's, yeah, and I agree. It's not necessarily one place, but also this is Wikipedia. So take it, I mean, you know, what it is, but ancient towns in Saudi Arabia. And notice Mecca and Medina are oddly missing. These are the oldest towns, and they're mentioning the towns that have historical record that proves their age. And notice the concentration here, and here. I mean, that's a little odd, you know, but nothing here.
The big nowhere.
So we've got you on the border with Yemen. You've got that and that. So just want to throw that out as something to note.
Yeah, so it really doesn't surprise me that they simply didn't have a city, so they had to do what they always do, which is, hey, are there any stories that we know about any cities? That one, okay, and then they just copy. So it has happened with the book and with the people. So, but let's see actually when we put more things together. And by the way, on that map that you have just shown, Lloyd, when we get to the end, I'm going to bring up something quite similar to that, and I think it's going to be quite cool. So
also, can I mention one thing, if I may, in advance? I don't want to. Odon, this may be of interest to you. I was doing some work the last couple of weeks trying to figure some things out, and I found a 1979 encyclopedia, historical research work by a couple of authors. They were studying the population growth and population movements for the last several thousand years, especially as relates to religious expansion or religious movements. And something interesting struck me. They, for the year roughly 500 AD, right, just before Islam, what they said was they calculate approximately 4 million people in this area that's highlighted in red here in Arabia, roughly 4 million. But they said the largest concentration of people was in Yemen, because Yemen had the agriculture to support it. It also had the thriving trade. It was a major empire, trading empire. It was trading all over, as far as Rome and Greece, India, and so on, possibly, potentially even as far as China. But they said so at least half the population of the entire Arabia was concentrated in Yemen. And then they said, they said that Yemen, what few people realize is it was a Jewish state. And they said the predominant religion in Arabia around that time was Judaism. Now that changes the picture a little bit.
No, it became a Jewish state. It used to be a Christian state.
Correct.
And there was a sort of coup backed by the Persians.
The interesting thing about this Jewish king, and I'm not saying the guy was Orthodox. I mean, he could have been a little offbeat. I think he was. But he had a policy of convert to Judaism or die, which may or may not sound familiar. So, but at one point, Judaism was the predominant religion in Arabia, which goes against a lot of claims like there were no Jews in Arabia, all the Jews were in Iraq, and there wasn't a single Jew to be seen in all of Arabia. So there's no way there were Jews there, that the Jews could have influenced any of the Arabs. So that kind of undermines that story now. So I'll discuss that another time, but I just thought I'd bring that up.
Well, once we get to the end is around that. So thank you for saying that, because like this, it will not be just me saying, hey, it looks like there was a lot of activity down there. Now we can both share the hate. So, which is great. But let's get to that. So Dan Gibson's Qibla walls, this is what Dan Gibson has found in that order. One has one in Eritrea during the Mohammed, period, and then the next one's in the north. It sort of looks like what we know from the standard Islamic narrative. They conquer the Arabian Peninsula, they push north. That makes perfect sense. One more in Jeddah during the, Rashidun period. So now, taking a little bit of the myth of this guy that we discussed last time, being Salman, according to their own sources, this guy, by the way, in Al-Tabari, I think they mention him with two names. First is Salman al-Farisi, but also that he could have had a different name altogether. So it's possible that this guy was also a blend of maybe two different individuals. But what their traditions say is that this guy was from Iran, He goes there, there, and there. He is a monk in each of those places, learning Christianity. And then when he's 50 years old, he joins a war, and he's a very good soldier. He becomes the governor of a city. So we know there is a problem with the story. They're merging something that doesn't make sense. A monk doesn't join a war when he's 50 and he's a killing machine. When we plot that with what the things that were happening at the time, there was a fight there in Antioch, which is very popular these days for different reasons. Then Damascus, and then Jerusalem, where basically everything starts. And not only that, the story of Bahira the monk is supposed to be in Busra, which is there. So the story that they created around this Salman guy, even if it was maybe a couple of people and they kind of merged them in a weird way, at least one of them was, by their own account, a mercenary. He would have been a Persian mercenary that was fighting with the Persians against the Byzantines. He ends up in Jerusalem. Certainly, the move suggests that. Looks quite pretty, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So now, the Jews were there in Jerusalem and around.
Although,
and then,
I believe at one time, in one of the Sira, the monk Bahira is also called George.
Sergius.
Yeah, but in another translation, I've seen the name George as well.
Yeah.
George. So
and Bahira, it's not a name. Bahira in Aramaic, it's teacher.
Okay, that's interesting.
And there's a verse in the Quran about this.
But teacher, could that be rabbi?
Bahira in the Quran.
A rabbi.
Not a rabbi.
Rabbi is teacher.
Yeah, maybe a rabbi, but not in the Jewish sense of the word. A master, a teacher.
Yeah, it's just that, I want to look at these possibilities of how these names came about, and we've got to put the possibilities down and then start to examine them and eliminate the ones that are weak. But, I don't want to...
I think the name Bahira came from the faint memory of Muhammad, or the one who had the Muhammad title, having been taught by Aramaic-speaking people.
Yeah, and Hansupius says Sergius the Nestorian, and in the Sira also there are lots of mentions of Nestorian. Well, there are mentions of Nestorians, so they do feature, especially in the polemics against St. Paul, that the Nestorians come up. Go on.
right. Okay. So after that fight, when the Persians conquered Jerusalem, so the Jews have a bit of, religious disagreements, and they get expelled. Possibly, they have to move from A to B, maybe to Iraq. And the central character of that story may have been a Muhammad. When we say, okay, but what happened with the early history of Islam, which we know is fabricated? Well, they start in Mecca, a city which we know didn't exist, certainly not in the way that it is described. It says that there is a religious disagreement when Mohammed, upsets the locals, and then the Hijra, they have to move from A to B, and they end up in Yathrib, where everything pretty much begins, or certainly it has the first Qibla wall that Dan Gibson has found, and the central character is Muhammad. And all pretty much in the same year. Now, I have heard two different stories about this. One from Mel, that move was triggered by a guy that was a Muhammad being assassinated in 617. And in your book, Odon, that in 614, the Judeo-Nazarenes, they are not really getting along with the rabbinic Jews, and they basically get expelled or something like that, if I understood it correctly. So is that right?
Yeah, that's what I gathered from Surah 48, the victory. If you look at it, if you look at the literal meaning of the text, it relates the story of an expulsion from the Temple Mount. There was a group of believers who tried to access the Temple Mount and perform sacrifices there. They had beasts with garlands and so on with them. And there was a sort of fight with other believers that were much more like them, but a bit different. And they refused. Actually, they refused to fight, and they fled. And they fled. And so, and the explanation for this shameful flee, the act of fleeing is a fled. Yeah, it's a fled. The shameful fled was that they they didn't dare fight because they were afraid to shed believers' blood. I think it was the rabbinic Jews, they're the sort of cousins of the Nazarenes. And this is developed in Edouard Marie Gallet's thesis. It's in my book. And recently, A.J. Deus did a paper on this also, Victory at Mecca, where he came to the same conclusion as me, which is that Surah 48 relates events that took place around the Temple Mount in Jerusalem in 614.
Right, and it would make sense seeing as the Mecca to Yathrib thing wouldn't have happened. It's just impossible because there is no Mecca to begin with, that they remembered something of people.
And there was no Yathrib as well, if these maps are to be, if there's at least this one report, we believe.
There was no Mecca, no Yathrib, no Mohammed, no Muslims, no Islam. The whole thing is just incredible.
If you look at it, there is a sort of common pattern between the actual history, so the group of believers being expelled from the holy city and taking refuge among Jews. There is a pattern that is exactly the same within the Islamic narrative. You might remember it, Lloyd. We did a video. The first video of the Decoding the Quran series, I tried to explain that there is something very, very odd. When you look at the Islamic narrative, you have a sort of pattern. There is a presentation of Mecca, and actually it fits Jerusalem. And everything that, every event that relates to, not every event, but most events that relate to Mecca in the Islamic narrative, sort of mimic what happened in actual history. The expulsion, the many tries to conquer Mecca again, and thereafter, eventually, the believers took the city with a sort of truce without shedding blood, which is exactly what happened when Jerusalem was taken around 638. Right. The doors were opened without a fight.
I should mention, in theory, there's the first Hijra is the one that goes to Ethiopia. And there you've got the old Ethiopian church, the Tewahedo church, where the word Tawhid comes from. And there are practices within that church that mimic Islam, which some would speculate they borrowed. There's certain practices like leaving your shoes outside, separating men and women, various coverings and other practices. So, I mean, but then again, Yemen was at one point, not Yemen, Ethiopia was at one point militarily, economically, socially dominant over that region as well.
Yeah.
And they had the oldest Bible. I mean, they also had the only complete Bible, They only had the complete Bible, which was in Arabia. So there might not have been an Arab Bible, but there was an Ethiopian Bible in Arabia.
I agree. There is an Ethiopian connection between the early believers with the early believers. And there is this.
His only lifelong companion was an Ethiopian woman.
Really?
Yeah, his witness. His mother didn't look after him. His witness was with him from the time he was born until the time she died. And the time he died, she was with him. So that was his only lifelong companion. She was an Ethiopian.
And there is something else also. When Egypt was taken by the Arab conquerors, they had Ethiopian troops with them.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
This makes sense because there is also a connection between the great Ethiopia and the south of Egypt.
Ethiopian troops were known to accompany the caravans that traveled on land. And they would also, when they did war, they would send their priests with them, and they would have a Bible. I mean, they had a Bible since what, the late 2nd century? So these guys had a Bible, and that Bible, and also, I mean, the traditions speak of these brothers you would listen to who recited the Bible in Ethiopic, and the only other language Muhammad is said to have spoken is Ethiopic. Now, not true or not, but the thing is, these references in the Sirah and Hadiths, I mean, they're all over the place, and in the Quran, you know. So. Sorry, JC, are we getting in the way of your talk here?
No, it's absolutely fine. And actually, some of the Qibla walls as well from Dan Gibson, some of the very early ones, they're actually as well in that region. And there are some things to do, like with the connection to the south, that I cannot actually put my finger on it. It's almost like I'm missing something. And the stuff that you are saying is something to do with that, maybe with the Ethiopic Bible. We will see. Maybe when we get to that, we have some ideas and say, okay, so this is how the dots can actually be joined.
Right.
But certainly, we're going to be talking, by the way, when I talk about the south, Ethiopia or Yemen, it's all like the southern area, and you will see why.
Yeah.
But
hey guys, one moment. I want to say, Mal, I am so sorry. It is my fault. I forgot Mal was 1 hour behind the rest of us. And when I told him 7 p.m., it was 6 o'clock for him. So that is entirely my fault.
It's an easy mistake. I've made that mistake myself. Well, it's great to be here. I'm sorry I missed the first bit, but
hello, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, and nice to meet Odon again.
Yeah, hello,
Nice to see you all.
Nice to see you, John, the Bearded Men Club.
Exactly. Yeah, we're
one of us.
The Trump dance, guys. The Trump dance.
I just need a red hat now, and I'm almost Santa here.
You're right. Yeah. Mel, do you have any questions before we go, or do you want a bit of a lead-in from JC on the thesis? Or?
Yeah, maybe just give me like a 90-second reminder, because I have seen your last live stream, but I've if you can in like a minute or 2 minutes just to get me up to speed again.
Sure. So in short, everything is a mess. The northern thesis is strong. And when we look at the Qibla walls and what was happening very early on, it looks almost as if they had no history. Nothing had happened that we could call Islam. And people just took those things that had happened in history and then they just changed the names. Oh, this was our city. Oh, that was our stories. They took names out, they put names in, and they said, that was us. Trust me, he wouldn't lie to you. Pretty much that.
Yeah. I understand it that you have looked at various story themes and you've seen patterns and obvious signs of fabrication where they've basically taken a story arc and then basically reused it if it was a good one in multiple places.
They didn't really have something, like absolutely no history, and they just have to borrow from people, they have to borrow from stories, from history, from anything that they can get their hands on. And actually, we didn't get to the part on the presentation where we're actually going through some of the stuff of, look, this is false, and some things like that. And of course now, because Mel, you have joined 1 hour late, I suppose that means that now we have 2 hours from now on the stream, right?
Okay, so I can handle too.
Yeah. Did Odon freeze again? Oh my gosh, because looks like Odon is frozen.
It's just when I said 2 more hours of this, he's back.
Yeah. Anything else you need to know, Mel, just to bring you up to speed?
No, I think I'm good to go.
Okay, cool. So let's actually go back.
You don't share your screen again. Just go back to your.
Wait.
Because it's I take it away and I put it back. That's all.
Okay, that's phenomenal. So let's see. I think we're on this one. All right. So just a very quick recap. Now that we know what these people did, these army people did, we see that they knew what they were doing. So basically, they start pretty much in Yathrib wherever they came from, whether it was from the Lahmeds, whether it came from a different region directly from Syria or Jerusalem, Yathrib seems to be like the very first place where things begin. Then they go south, they take the weak trade route, then they just take the rest of the south of the peninsula. They conquer or they take over the water routes. At that point, they either control the trade or they can assault ships. So money starts really in. They take the rest of the peninsula and then they push north. And by coincidence,
I presume this is the standard Islamic narratives version rather than what you think is historically happened, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Conquer a lot of land because at one point we need to go back to Jerusalem and conquer everything. And when we see the Qibla walls, it's like, what plan in their minds? Right?
Sorry, you broke up for me at least, so I'm not sure what the last couple of sentences were.
That it looks like they knew what they were doing and they wanted to conquer a lot of land before they could actually push back to Jerusalem and did what they did. But
so this was a well-organized military group that had military intention. Conquest was on their minds.
Yes, these are not people who were just assaulting caravans and things get out of hand. These are not caravan traders. These are people that they certainly know how to play every single advantage that they have, and whether they have to capture people and sell them to slavery or bully people, sign alliances and then break them, whatever they need to do, they are going to conquer that. In fact, they did. And we know that there were many fights even from the start. So these people were not the sort of people you want them you don't want them too near. You cannot truly trust them. But they knew what they were doing, and certainly they were very, very successful. But
and I think within 5 years of Muhammad's death, they'd conquered 22 countries.
And even according to their own legend, which of course is not true, but the moment that he dies, everyone starts killing each other. So, sorry, unaliving each other. So, yeah. Now, a little bit of trying to put like some things together and a first hypothesis. So the first Qibla wall that Dan Gibson found being 6:2, I don't know actually if they were before, and it's probably worth noting that their masjids, they are synagogues. It's just copy-paste, they copied everything. And a masjid is a synagogue. It just faces slightly in the direction that they want to face. Then in the standard Islamic narrative, the direction of prayer, it is still remembered to this day that it was Umar who said, hey, let's pray in a given direction. And then, oh, that's actually in the book. What a coincidence. So that story is attached to him for some reason. And what the standard Islamic narrative says is 6:2 is the Hijra, and then Mohammed upsets the locals and he gets a new direction of prayer. Now, for Mel, because I saw Mel in one of your...
Breaking up there.
Broke up again.
I broke up? Am I?
Yeah. Yeah, your last sentence.
Yeah. Okay, so hopefully am I back now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Mel, I saw on one of your videos that you said the dating of the early Islamic history was probably out by about 4 years, something like that. And I just thought I would bring this up. If it was 4 years basically in that direction, and that thing that this story that they disagreed with the Jews and then they decided to pray in a different direction than Jerusalem, that would have been around 620, and it would actually fit like a glove with Dan Gibson's first Qibla wall found facing in a direction that is not Jerusalem.
I think what you're doing is a bit problematic for me because I think you need to get solid foundations. You can't just mix and match things that are of different levels of certainty. So I'm a bit uncomfortable with this because I think we need to go back to more basic stuff before we get to this.
But if someone's trying to create a fictional narrative, that they're not very interested necessarily in fact, They're interested in events that they can use to build a fictional narrative.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I'm sort of at a disadvantage because I don't know what was said prior to this, so it's a little bit difficult. I don't accept Dan Gibson's material any longer for multiple reasons. A lot of problems with the methodology. His assurance about dates is massively up to question. So I don't think you can use his assertions about dating because essentially most of these early mosques we cannot date. They don't come with inscriptions saying when they were founded. So it's a lot of it is a judgment call. Despite the impression he gives, he's not an archaeologist. He often overwrites. What's the word for it? He comes to a site in Petra where there's archaeologists, for example, working near a temple for 20 plus years, and he basically doesn't read their papers, and then asserts things about where the Kaaba is. So things like that raised a lot of red flags for me. So I wouldn't use Dan Gibson's stuff, unfortunately, even though I used to be have a high level of confidence in what he was doing, but unfortunately there's certain things you can't do. One of them is if you know an archaeologist has been working on the site, you can't just ignore what they're finding and then come up with a hypothesis that is contrary to what they're saying. So that's why I wouldn't give any credence to any dating he does, because it's problematic for me, you know.
Yeah, well, no, not at all. I just actually saw that and I thought, well, if this would help say, hang on a minute, then actually makes things fit a bit better, then great. And after all, I'm trying to come up with an actual narrative, as in a story of how the fiction or how the fiction that we have was inspired by things. So, for example, even by the dates that we have from the standard Islamic narrative, that it was 6 to 4, if we take that then 4 years back, this is what I try to think. Okay, so if we take that 4 years back, because the dating could be wrong, is there anything that happened then in 620 that could have influenced this? And then I think, okay, so when were the Jews expelled from Jerusalem? Did it actually happen around that time? So I'm trying to create something that or rather try to understand it in a narrative that makes sense from a storytelling perspective. For example, and actually
can I just jump in just very quickly? This is a point I forgot to say. I think what you need to bear in mind is that they have a Quran and now they're trying to impose meaning onto it. So they're part of what they're doing with the Hadiths is they're retroactively placing meanings on the verses. So what there's the danger of is there's a circular argument being developed, you know, and that's dangerous, you know. So this hadith, for example, is trying to make sense of what the Quran says about the change in the Qibla, and so we can't really draw anything from that because that's literally a few centuries later superimposed on the Quran, which they now no longer understand. And I'm sure Odon you could be able to talk about how far wrong they are in terms of the meaning of the Quran, you know, as well. So that's what I would caution about that, you know.
Yeah, I actually have a couple of slides on some of the problems with the narrative in the Quran, but that hadith in particular, that is the sort of hadith that they should have removed from the records, because it doesn't say that it was Mohammed who said, hey, let's pray in one direction. It's actually an hadith that says that this other guy said before Mohammed, hey, let's pray in a given direction, and God has agreed with me. So this is the sort of things that make me think this is embarrassing and it causes problems, because Umar, according to their own story, it could all be fictitious, but this is what they wrote, that Umar said, let's pray in a direction, and then God agrees, and then it's in the Quran. So it's like, yeah, that is sus. So when there is something they should have removed they should have censored and they didn't, is like, okay, there is something in there, and then I start digging. And actually, hopefully this example will show like what is that I'm trying to do, basically to open questions more than anything else. And is this, so the story about praying in a given direction, according to their traditions, it actually begins with Umar. He's the one that says, hey, we should pray in a given direction. That should not be in the hadiths. That should have been censored, but they didn't. Also, Umar happens to be the guy that ends up going to Jerusalem and probably building the third temple, or at least beginning the process, is a bit like suspicious. Now, like a second part of this is the story is attached to Mohammed having this disagreement with the Jews, and that could be just, the old-fashioned Jew hatred that they just shoehorn it in every story they can. But what if the reason that they decided to not pray towards Jerusalem, when there is so much about Judaism in the actual Quran, was because they actually disagreed? You have the Arabs and you have the Judeo-Nazarenes, and they actually have a disagreement that becomes, at one point, the story of not accepting Mohammed, but starting with an actual problem. Right after that, after this problem that they have, is when they start killing each other. So, for example, could it be, and I know this is all very hypothetical, that the Arab leader, whoever it is, whether it's Umar or another guy or other guys that were before, they don't need the Jews anymore. First, they are all buddy-buddy, they hold hands and sing Kumbaya, and they're all going to go back to Jerusalem and reconquer it. But almost immediately, they are not happy anymore. They have trouble, and the Arab leaders are the ones that say, you want to be the Muhammad? Well, I can be the Muhammad, and we're going to do the heavy lifting. And the stories that come with very early on in the history, not accepting the Muhammad, could have been they didn't accept the ruler of the Arab, who then takes the title, and so on. That could happen either during the 620s, at the very start of the whole thing, or after reading Odon's book, the Umar seems to have had a little bit of a problem with the Judeo-Nazarenes at around the year 640, if I remember correctly from the book. That could be the thing that influences the story of the Jews having a problem with the Mohammed, and they start killing them very soon after. So, what do you guys think?
Now, the thing I put in my book is my interpretation of the Jewish tradition. The Jewish tradition states that around 640 or 642, the Jews who were allowed back into Jerusalem by the Arabs, because beforehand Jerusalem was forbidden to them by the Byzantines. The Jews were expelled by these very same Arabs. So something happened. And when you connect the dots with other sources, namely the Chronicle of Sebeos, Sebeos talks about, Sebeos or pseudo-Sebeos, he talks about a dispute, a strife between Jews and Arabs about the occupation of the Temple Mount. So when you connect the dots with what we already know from the Quran, from the project of rebuilding the temple that is written in the Quran, there is a case for an explanation of this disagreement with the Jews. As you put it, a very strong disagreement.
Yeah, just in terms of the Jewish relationships with the Persians and with the Arabs, it was very tumultuous, let's say, in the early 7th century. So if we kind of think back, the Persians formed an alliance with the Jews to conquer Jerusalem, and they basically had promised that the Jews could have their homeland again. So that was why the Jews formed the alliance. Now the problem was, according to a number of sources, and unfortunately I don't have the name of the source to hand, but there is a monk who wrote an account of the conquest of Jerusalem, and the story goes that the Jews basically got bloodthirsty and killed some Christians, and it was quite horrific. And now, if you bear in mind that one of the things that the Persians did was bring the true cross back to Persia, the question you should be asking yourself is, why would the Persians care about the cross? And one of the reasons is that Khosrow's wife was Shirin, who was a Christian. And so therefore, she had a lot of sway there, even though her husband wasn't Christian. He was sympathetic. So with this killing, she would have been very upset. So the brief alliance between the Persians and Jews were broken as a result of this killing. And so the Jews then later formed an alliance with the Arabs. So that's why it switched in the second conquest. Why it's Arabs and not Jews. The other thing that complicates things is that many of the Jews that lived in Iraq spoke Arab. So the historical accounts that refer to Arabs, we're not entirely sure if actually some or many of these Arabs could actually have been Jews as well. That's where it's very hard to disentangle. So it's quite a complex story.
Yeah, it's like the Christians in even Spain, and also sometimes I think in some of these documents they've named the Christians with Arabic names to basically co-opt the Islamic Golden Age, which was the Christian Golden Age, but just renamed for fictional purposes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, certainly back in those days, the Arabs and the Jews, they had a very complicated relationship. But hey, that's a thing of the past. It's not like that thing continues nowadays. Things have improved, haven't they? So the Quran, I'm going to pretty much just skip through this very quickly because it's exactly what Odon said actually pretty much at the very start, and Mel as well, which is the Quran says something very different to what we are reading into it. That is actually extracts from the Saint Murad translations, the verses that talk about virgins in paradise. And when you actually read his translation, you will see that most of the key words, fruits, water, garden, and then words that he doesn't translate because they are not Arabic words, which of course it actually looks very much like what Christoph Luxemburg says, that it was talking about grapes. But the book said one thing, and on top they've put another thing called the standard Islamic narrative, or no virgins in paradise. It was talking a fruit-based reward. Others, like this one here, which is starting to make the rounds. I heard this one from the Christian Prince, and then we talked about it here on the channel because I was so impressed. And now I have seen it in Odon's book as well, which is the line, that verse of the night journey is not talking about night journey, but it's just about Moses. So they created that obviously after the time of John of Damascus on top of it. And even they changed the name of the surah. It was called Bani Israel. And of course, if you start reading Bani Israel, exalted is he who took his servant by night, you know it's talking about Bani Israel. They changed the name to Al-Isra. Oh, all of a sudden...
Technically, it's not renamed. It was just that colloquially in certain regions, it was known as the Israeli surah because it deals so heavily on the topic. So...
Oh, really? I actually thought it was the main thing. Actually, Isra, Al-Isra, Israel. Is that a little bit close?
I'm not sure, but I looked into was it renamed, but apparently not. But it was very commonly known by that name. So that was just the common name for it, rather than the actual written title.
Well, it would make sense because in the very early times, they knew that there was, no Mohammed, no Burak, no night journey, and that verse, when they heard it spoken out loud, they knew what the story about Moses was.
Also, the Hadiths were all known as the Israeliyat, and they used to quote the Midrash of the Jews, and then at some point they removed them all. So at one point there was that overlap.
Is there anything they didn't copy? That's the mystery to solve.
Intelligence.
Well, another thing that they never actually managed to do is proofreading. That's something that escaped them, but we will see actually why.
True.
Now, the satanic verses, in order to find a solution to that problem, you have to go to a different surah, which is supposed to be forbidden in Islam. The one that says about that Satan spoke, or when one of the messengers or prophets spoke, Satan threw into them. I didn't write the Saint Murad's version in here because it's one of the difficult to understand, but he doesn't translate it as spoke, is wish. It's more like a messenger or a prophet, like Satan would throw a wish into the head of a messenger or a prophet, and is like who? Okay, well, that verse there that it says, and so those who were given knowledge, and it's part of the same section, we found that on the very first stream that we did together, Lloyd, when we spoke about the Sharia, the 3 verses that they speak about Sharia, which they're just talking about the Injil, they use something very similar, except after knowledge had come to them. That meaning people basically learning about Jesus, the Injil, whatever they had in mind, but to do with Jesus. So I think that the verse that they use in order to excuse the satanic verses happens to be the story of Jesus and Satan, of Satan trying to seduce Jesus, and they repurpose that story to say, oh, you see, every single person had that, and that verse is not Momo. Sorry, it's not Jesus, it's actually Momo. And that's why that verse is there. So that's just kind of like my take on it.
I actually think this whole thing is, not saying you, but I think this whole thing has been massively misunderstood for apologetic reasons. And I think Christians have gone too far with this and actually not done the work to really understand what's going on. I think actually that this person who's writing in this originally, what they were trying to get at is that angels, because it's actually in chapter 53, it's talking about angels, if my memory serves me right, and it's trying to argue that belief in angels is not the same thing as pagan idols. So then in this context, it's basically referring to the idols and gods of the past and saying it's not like that, it's something different. So it's okay for it to. So I think there's a totally different meaning to all of this, which is perfectly fine. And that actually could be more a homiletic, but because it's been heavily edited, the original meaning has been lost.
Yes, but and I totally agree.
It's a very different take. But as it stands now, it's massively problematic. If you because you can't really get back to the original meaning. But as it stands, it's very hard for Muslims to stand over this because it's given a really bad impression, and it gives because the standard Islamic narrative is projecting a story of how this surah came about, where Muhammad is trying to get a revelation, and then there's this reference here to Satan putting these words in his mouth and all that. That's because of the standard Islamic narrative. It's not actually what was intended originally.
Yep.
Haven't these verses been removed from some Qurans?
Yes, that's the thing. Actually, it's in verse 20 and 21. There are some parts that have been edited, and we have traces of these parts in the tradition, in Tabaris mostly.
Right.
And it shows that the Quran was edited after Tabaris.
Yeah. Ooh.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
This is
that's
what
the 900s.
Very, very problematic.
Yeah.
For Islam, for Muslims.
By the way, Sean Anderson says it was originally Surah Bani Israel. Look at all the pre-1948 printings of the Quran.
Wow.
So in which case, then they've made a change. Because when I looked into it, I was, that's what I found. I mean, I didn't spend a week on it. But
actually, something significant is 1948, I think, isn't there? State of Israel, 1948.
No, come on.
Thank you, Sean, and very well spotted, Mel. How did I miss that?
Thank you,
I don't think you want a surah called Bani Israel after the State of Israel is formed.
Yeah.
That's not
wow, that's that's very on the nose, but well spotted, Mel. I missed that somehow.
Okay.
It only occurred to me just as you're saying it.
As you all know, by the way, they are actually in the process of changing that. Now it's going to be called Bani Palestina, but never mind that.
Okay, Sean,
of course, that's the other one. Palestine is not mentioned anywhere in the Quran.
Shortened to Isra, which means a journey. So that's how they got around
very
it.
convenient. Yeah. So I just double check. I'm pretty certain State of Israel, 1948. Let's just check.
Yes, no, you're right. 48. Yeah.
Yeah.
So well done. And actually, you guys are proving that it really takes a village to unpick all of this. Now, a couple of other things. And now we can actually see this is like my take of trying to read things within the text that is not just about what the text says. That's actually on the next slide. So, you would expect to have on this text, on this Quran, a lot of stuff to do with the Jews, of course. I mean, it's Jerusalem, Egypt, and so on, those places will be in there because they're part of their stories. But the moment that you have something to do with a camel, or you have Alut, Alat, Almanat, or you have anything like that, it's like, hang on a minute, you were supposed to be an Abrahamic faith. Therefore, those things do not belong anywhere in an Abrahamic faith. This is new. It's about people being there on the ground and doing things. We have Mecca. Well, we have about booty and stuff. Where is that in an Abrahamic faith after the coming of Jesus? So obviously there's problems. We have Mecca and we have Yathrib, maybe inserted late, but they appear once, each of them. So at one point, we know that they are there. Then from the satanic verses, they mention this Allat, Alut, and Almanat. And they are certainly not speaking with people in Japan or in Mexico, because they wouldn't understand what that is. So those verses made it in there, nothing to do with the Abrahamic faith, but because people are there on the ground speaking with people, and they mention those things.
And they were definitely worshipped in Petra. I mean, that's known.
Yes, and the whole thing with the stones, there were probably more than one stone and trees, and they basically worship anything that they could have their hands on. And they have stories in their own traditions about the three goddesses and how, they go and kill one, and, the whole thing is just not from the Abrahamic faith, and they have so much from that. But something that actually got my attention were these verses, are the ones that talk, basically the ones that include the Sabians, because the thing that really got my attention is that we often ignore that order is important. And if you were addressing a crowd with, 10 Buddhists, 10 Hindus, and 100 Hare Krishna, probably will say, hey, my friends, my Hare Krishna friends, and you would go with where you have the numbers. All of these verses, they happen to mention first the Jews. The Christians, or the Nasara, or whatever denomination they call them, they're actually not number 2. They go to number 3, because Sabians, they get the number 2 stop, and then they have a little bit of Magians. Now, that is very odd in an Abrahamic setting, but I think these would have been spoken out loud in a place where there were majority Jews, lots of Sabians, lots of Christians in any denomination, and then some Magians, which I would think it would most likely be in that region. And just for avoidance of doubt, and we'll cover something else in a minute, I don't think these were the only verses, the only versions. These verses, they would have been spoken out loud down there. But if they were being telling these verses, say in Iraq, they probably would have said those who are Zoroastrians or Christians or whatever. They would have mentioned the big numbers of people first, but the fact that the ones we have in the Quran now, they actually start with that order and they put the Sabians very, very high. What I'm hinting at is maybe they actually borrowed the version of the Quran from down there, or quite a few pieces they borrowed from there before they canonized it.
Yeah. Just a distinction. There's these Sabians, who are the Yemenis, and there are the Sabians, who are on the border with Syria, Turkey. And that's where Abraham's family comes from. So Abraham's from the Sabians. The Sabians are sort of Gnostics, pagan moon worshippers, and the Sabians are Babylonians. And the Quran, while it seems to mix the two without distinction, but it seems to lean towards the Sabians, who are the ones from Haran, up Turkey-Syria border, just over the border into Syria, tend to lean towards the Sabians. And also Muhammad is called a Sabi on several occasions in the Hadiths, which seems to be a Sabian.
I would add to that they are also found in southern Iraq as well, the Sabians. So
yeah,
the problem with saying that it's more probably down in Yemen versus the other, I don't think there's anything in what you're saying really strong enough to make that. It could be either. It could be up near Turkey, it could be in Iraq, or
I mean, look, it's clear. I would say there's a case for both. I'd say there's a case for both rather than just selecting one.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is not the only thing. So there will be now other things why I think I'm pushing some things to do with Yemen, and this one is only like a step one. But we will see other things. Just trying to put these pieces together, and this one was one that caught my attention because at least this groups, I think the order is important. And
Okay.
the fact that Magians would not really make an appearance with the others only once, it tells me that wherever these things happen may have been taken from the regions where these people were in, say, great-ish numbers. If they were Hindus or something, they wouldn't get a mention, basically. Yep, happy. Anybody wants to add something else?
No, very interesting. I mean, but if that empire had grown, they were trying to appeal to everybody, north, south, east, and west, basically.
Yes, and now actually, and bringing in a little bit of something that you, Lloyd, said, and I think, Mel, you mentioned something, which is to do with Tawhid. When I read the Quran, I know that it changed over a really long period of time, and hopefully I will put some more dots into this story, is I think everything started with the Judeo-Nazarenes, as Odon says in his book. So everything starts from the north, and then it actually goes south. But as it happens, it actually picks up a lot of stuff like Allat, Al-Lutz, Al-Manat. I don't really imagine those guys having much sympathy for polytheists and things like that. So, but those words that they're spoken is not to do now with religion. It's more about these conquering kings that they are going to say anything that they want, or anything anyone needs to hear. Or, in other words, Tawhid, which obviously Muslims say it means oneness, but it doesn't. It means unification, which when I see the Quran with all of these different things and their traditions, it feels almost like these people, they were going south and they were telling people what they needed to hear. So if you worship the three daughters of Allah, they'll tell you, hey, don't worry, because if you think about it, you're really worshiping the father of the daughters of Allah. So Allah, if you're licking a stone, don't worry, you are not a pagan. You are actually worshiping the God that sent you the stone. When we see the Quran and it has all of these weird things, it says that Jesus is Lord and that he died, but also he didn't die, and so on and so forth. You see that they have merged stories from all sorts. So I do almost have the feeling that these people did not really care about religion. The original guys, yes, but that went south literally, like very, very quickly. And they started just adding anything and everything. Basically, everything goes, which is something, Lloyd, you discuss when you go through Sharia, and it looks like everything is permissible because everything has an out clause.
Yeah. If I can just add to that, the term Tawheed, there's multiple spellings. So hang on, let me just bring this up. Slideshow.
Yeah, I can't remember. I just picked one, but I've seen it.
So I'll just bring this up. Let me just close that. Yeah, the term Tawheed, this is actually a series of slides I haven't presented yet. I've finished this ages ago, but I want to go back and fix it. Tawahedo, whatever. It's from the Ge'ez, right? The ancient language of Ethiopia. And it's a word that means being made one, to be unified or unification. And Tawahidos, the modern pronunciation is Tewahedo. But it is related to the Arabic word tawhid, understood as monotheism, but more literally, it is unification to become one. And it is the term is from the church's original Miaphysite belief. So they were non-Chalcedonian, although I think that this particular belief this rift has been healed, and they're now on the same page as the other, sort of like the Catholic Church and others. So this was the belief back then in the Oriental Orthodox Church. There were Christological disputes about the nature of Jesus, but at the time, this was the belief that there was the unity of God with his two divine natures, divine and human nature. So it's becoming one, and it's definitely not a single thing. It's definitely, I mean, there's a longer passage here in this whole thing, but this is it. It's a Christian term they took from the Ethiopians. That's the origin. It's definitely not Arabic. And it's one of many words they've taken from the Ethiopic.
Yeah, there's also another word in the Quran for the uniqueness of God, which the Islamic narrative did not understand. It comes from Aramaic. It's in Surah 112. God is one. Let me take the English version. He is the one, supposedly the eternal or the absolute, as Samad. As Samad, actually, it means exactly the same meaning as Tawhid. He is united. And it is a Christian word from Aramaic. I think it's Christoph Luxemburg who put it in his book.
Right.
And it's another case for Christian influences in the Quran.
Right. Yeah, and you
Whether
can see here
from Ethiopia or from elsewhere.
So something to add to all of this, just as a kind of a word of caution in terms of drawing too many conclusions from the vocabulary, is currently I'm doing a study with a guy in Malta on the influences of languages in Maltese, which is an ancient kind of form of Arabic. And what we're discovering is that vocabulary from lots of different languages was spreading right across the Mediterranean at will. And that's the case. You can't draw conclusions just because, and I'm not being, hopefully I'm not coming across critical, but it's a kind of realization to me, is even in the Quran where you have bits of words from here, there, and everywhere, we can't draw conclusions that necessarily means that the people must have been from those places, because that vocabulary did spread, because the Mediterranean was one big melting pot where people traveled on ships, words went around. There was multilingualism. It's a mess. So it's much harder than I thought to actually make a case on linguistics alone in terms of where things happened. That's the sort of word of caution I would give.
No, sure. Let me just do this then. Just in response to that, though, there are traditions as to Muhammad's great linguistic attainments, and he is said to have been particularly skilled in Ethiopic, and that goes back all the way to Goldziah and others, right? And just in the traditions, his first nurse was an Abyssinian woman, whom Ayman, the man he chose as the first muezzin, was Bilal al-Habashi, and that is al-Habasha, that is Ethiopian. And the Prophet was particularly skilled in the Ethiopic language, supposedly. Early Arabic referred to the language of South Arabia, and this language or language group, as revealed to us from the inscriptions of the Manaean, Sabaean, and Himyaritic, and other kingdoms, belongs to the South Semitic and is closely related to Ethiopic, the language of Abyssinia. So the language would seem to have been supplanted by Arabic as a spoken language in those regions, even before Muhammad. There can be no doubt that the words of South Arabian origin could have found their way into Arabic from these scattered communities. I mean, so there's evidence, at least, that there's lots of cultural overlap, historical overlap, and within the. I mean, I'll leave this here. I think that's enough for now on that. I'll just put your screen back.
All right. Whoa. Okay. So let's go back to this. This one now. This is something that you guys have discussed before, and I'm going to not go in detail because we're getting through all of these slides, and the next section is going to be very interesting. But it is basically things like this. So we know, by the way, the inspiration of this was from many months ago. I saw videos from Mel and from Saint Murad really making a very, very strong argument that Mohammed is not in the book. The 4 times that Mohammed or Mim Hamim Dal appears in the book, they actually mean someone else. So once I realized that, I thought, hang on a minute. So why do I keep reading Mohammed everywhere in the book? So I went through it and say, no, this is not Mohammed. So who is it talking about? And when you remove the standard Islamic narrative from the book, you see things like it's very, very straightforward. So who is the unlettered prophet? Well, Jesus. They were saying this. I'm not saying this is the biblical account, but they said the guy that was born in, a displaced family and he was a carpenter. And now I have seen this as well on Odon's book. So it's like, okay, fine. So it makes just perfect sense. The very next verse, that unlettered prophet, Jesus, whom they find written in what they have of the Torah and the gospel. And it's like, all right, yes, he is on both. So that makes sense. But then that triggers the Islamic dilemma of Muslims saying the unlettered prophet is Muhammad. So he is in the Torah and the Injil, and the Christian says, no, he isn't. He's never been. Okay, so you've corrupted the scriptures. And he's like, no, but your book confirms the scriptures. That doesn't make any sense. No, you then did it after. You did it after. And he's like, no, guys. So that the whole thing about the Islamic dilemma is they're discussing the standard Islamic narrative interpretation of a verse that is simply saying Jesus, who is in the Torah and the gospel, and right after, honor him and follow the light which was sent down with him. Oh, look, it also acknowledges the Holy Spirit. It just becomes incredibly simple. Then other verses exactly the same. Once you remove Mohammed because he's not there, and you think, okay, so who is this talking about? Very, very often you see that it is all about Jesus, or rather the different versions of him, because sometimes they thought, some of the verses think that Jesus was given a book. Some verses think that he was given miracles. Some verses think that he was given both. So they have all of this potpourri of stuff. And the one verse that almost unlocks this for me is this one, Surah 5, verse 46, because they should have removed this one from the Quran. This one shouldn't be there because it gives the game away. The Quran usually says something was sent down confirming that which was before, or something like that. But this one actually says Jesus, we sent Jesus confirming that which came before him in the Torah.
Well,
okay,
in the
Jesus.
Torah.
Hello. Am I back?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So Jesus confirming the Torah, and immediately, and he got the gospel, and the gospel confirms the Torah. That is a verse they should have removed from the Quran, or they should have removed the words Jesus and Torah, yes, right, book or scripture. They messed up, and this one just explains how every time the book says something was sent down means Jesus or the gospel, and so on. And with this, we could just be talking even for days, because there is lots of stuff that is not talking about Mohammed at all, which is phenomenal.
I mean,
So
Jesus is mentioned. Jesus is mentioned. I checked. I had it before, almost 180 something times. He's referenced. He's named about 25. He's referenced about 180 times. Muhammad is named, if you stretch it, 4 times.
Yeah.
Yes. If you don't think about the meaning, then that name or that sequence appears 4 times. When you look at the context, is like no. And Mel and Saint Murad have explained this like in detail. I have checked and double checked as well with Saint Murad's version and with AI, and yeah, it's the same. Mohammed is not there.
And actually, even Muhammad isn't there 4 times. It's Mahmed.
Yeah.
Presumably, you have to put the diacritical marks to get Muhammad. And Mahmed, as we've seen from a 1518 AD inscription, a Jewish inscription, Mahmed is used as a synonym for Messiah. So if you take that into account with Jesus, obviously most people at that time believed Jesus was the Messiah. The Jews had a disagreement about it. There's a big argument about who's the Messiah. The Jews are hoping on one of their leaders to be the Messiah. The Christians are basically poking their, putting up their 2 fingers and saying, no, we have the Messiah, and they're putting Mahmed on their coins with crosses. So I think there's a debate going on. The Quran is caught up in the mix of all of this, But really, if you throw out the Mahmeds, which is just a messianic title, what have you got? You got no Muhammad of Arabia there. There's nothing there. Most of it is about Jesus.
Yeah.
There's something tricky in the Quran about the so-called unlettered prophet. You quoted Surah Al-Araf, Surah 7, verse 157. If you just look the following verse, 158, there's something. Here is the trick. The verse begins, say, people, surely I am the messenger. And it goes on also by referring the unlettered prophet. And so there is a sort of confusion here in this verse between someone who is proclaiming himself a messenger, actually not a messenger, but a Rasul, an envoy, and a confusion with the unlettered messenger, or the messenger for the common people. And I think because of this confusion, it was easier for the one who forged the Islamic narrative to fabricate the idea that the unlettered prophet was Muhammad himself, was the one who was speaking in the Quran.
Yeah, can I also add?
Yeah,
I can also add to that the word that's used in Arabic. It is a word that can also mean Gentile.
Yeah, Gentile.
So that's
common people.
Yeah.
Umi.
The Gentile prophet as opposed to the Jewish prophet.
And it could also mean not the Gentile prophet, but the prophet for the common people, for the Gentile.
For the in that sense as well, yeah.
And that's Jesus. Jesus is the one who took Judaism outside of the Jews to the common people, to the non-Jews, to the Arabs especially.
Well, that's interesting. There are many assertions Muslims make that are not explicitly in the Quran, that are not in the Quran, is what I mean by that. But culturally, the impression like he's a prophet for the whole world. That's not stated in the Quran as far as I know, but that idea is there, and this would explain where that cultural idea is and why it's remained so persistent. That there's a context that they have retained that's not in the written text, that comes from the Christian context. I mean, would that make sense?
So.
Yeah, and they call him in lots of places like the light, and from there, because that is the description of Jesus, they say, okay, so he's the light, so this has to be our guy. So what does it mean? Oh, well, he was created from the Nur and the Ruh, and it's like, no, he didn't exist. That is one of the miracles of Islam. The Prophet of Islam is the only guy who doesn't appear in the Torah, the Injil, or the Quran. He's not there. But they have a whole story about him, which is copy-pasted from all different sources, including saying like he was great. And it's like in any kind of verses. And when you read them again, you will see it's about Jesus. So it's all very silly.
Okay. You mentioned about the light there. If I can quote you a Jewish text called Pesita Rabbati in chapter 36. It says, what is meant by in your light do we see light, Psalm 36:9. What light is it that the congregation of Israel looks for as from a watchtower? It is the light of the Messiah, as it is said, and God saw the light and it was good. So from a Jewish perspective, which the Arabs were obviously following, any references to light was a Messianic reference. Again, tying in with the whole Mahmoud thing.
Although
I think
that said,
there's a book to be written. I think there's a book yet to be written on the Messianic themes that's running right through the Quran.
Although I must say though that the whole idea of the Nur refers to moonlight. So for whatever reason, they have this heavy reliance on moonlight as opposed to sunlight, which is a different word. So they've got this whole moon thing going as well when it comes to these references.
Yeah. A funny thing also to add is that since they were confusing Jesus with Muhammad, Jesus is described in the Quran as the one who comes with light and guidance and instruction. The Islamic narrative invented stories about Muhammad bringing light. And there is one that is particularly funny, where Aisha is a child bride, lost a needle in her room at night. But Muhammad came with light. Light was pouring out of him. And because of this, Aisha was able to find the precious needle.
In fact, there's a hilarious one in the Sirah about Muhammad being in the womb, and the light is so great that it's shining light on castles in Syria, which is quite incredible.
This is insane. This is clown world. It's unbelievable. And when you can see where they copied like a little story or something saying Jesus is the light. Okay, so that's our guy. And what does it mean, the light? And then they make up all of these things and they copied from other heretic stories. But so once I actually saw that stuff from Mel and Saint Murad, and I thought, oh, Mohammed is not in the book, so let me read it again. And I then started to see, okay, so that means Moses, or that means Jesus. This means someone else. And the formula pretty much applies everywhere. Something sent down, confirming something from before, Jesus or the Torah, Jesus or the Injil, confirming the Torah. In whichever way the writer thought at that point, heretic Jesus, Trinitarian Jesus, it fits with everything except on this one verse that I have found, maybe more, where it actually doesn't make sense in whichever way you look at it. Because if you think in that way, so God, has sent down upon you the Injil, the gospel in truth, confirming the Torah. Okay, but then immediately after, and he revealed the Torah and the gospel, it's like, hang on a minute, but you just said you're repeating stuff. But if you think standard Islamic narrative, it also doesn't make sense. He has sent down upon you the Quran confirming the Torah and the Injil. Oh, and he revealed the Torah and the Injil. It's like, this, you're not making any sense. But that surah doesn't end there. The thing is that, well, the verse, it says at the end, and he revealed the Torah and the gospel before. But that word before goes to the next verse. So the next verse starts with before, and then I stop, and then it continues. It's like, come on, this that looks to me either like a late insertion or something very weird. It breaks up a verse before.
It's stuck in a full stop.
Yeah, it's weird, but So let's get to the very interesting stuff. All right, at least I hope you're going to find this very, very interesting, and hopefully we have a little bit more than half an hour, and we can cover the rest. Let's have a look at some of the stuff that is missing from the current Quran based on what there was before, and then we're going to try to put everything together into why I think the South kicks in at. So surah's missing. That one is missing. That one is missing. According to their own traditions, this is nothing to do with us. Their hadith say there were those surahs and they are gone. Also, a sheep ate some verses. I've put that one actually to remind me. I have a video which I think is very, very funny. I find it funny. Memoirs of a peckish sheep on my channel. So if anyone wants to watch it later, I hope you will find it half as funny as I do. My rendition of the sheep eating the verses according to their own traditions. They also argue the first and the last surahs, whether they were added late, and the satanic verses, of course, changed. And I'm sure that there is more. These ones are the ones that I have just heard again, but I'm sure that you guys would know a few other stuff in the traditions saying that the Quran has been corrupted by their own hands. Even the Shias. The Shias say the Quran is completely corrupted. They had a book, they had a Quran from Ali, but Uthman, aka Al-Hajjaj, just created a new one, and they're waiting for the one from Ali.
Well, here's a conundrum. I just want to throw this at you. No one can corrupt Allah's word. However, Allah's word is corrupted. So therefore, only Allah could have corrupted his word.
Mm-hmm.
That's deep.
The great schema.
So the question is, why would Allah corrupt his word? Muslims need to answer that.
You know who's best?
That's a good answer. I like it.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, we need to start asking them really simple. Now we've got the internet, we've got the tools, we've got the people, but like, question, what historical evidence, what evidence from surrounding cultures, from any written work of the time, show that Abraham was in Mecca 2000 BC? What evidence is there? Muslims, because they'll say the Quran said it. The Quran said that the Quran is true, and the Quran is true, so therefore Abraham was there, and Abraham was there because the Quran's. That's circular logic. That's not evidence. What evidence is there?
But the thing is, the Quran.
We need to ask, and these are things we're raising, and we need to turn these into simple questions we can ask.
I think you're absolutely right about that. The thing is, when you said they say the Quran says those things, no, the Quran doesn't say any of that. That's pretty much like what we saw before on that very weird thing. Yep. Like, maybe we need to write an actual, say, tafsir where we actually say, look, this is what the verse says. It's not talking about Momo. It's talking about, that guy.
Yeah, but Odon said something earlier that made me think, slightly off topic, but Odin said, look, when you look at the Quran, and you're saying it too, in fact, we've all kind of been saying this, the Quran says when you read the sentence, it actually says, but the question is, how do you know that's what it says? Well, because something that came out of Thomas Aquinas was the scholastic method, but from that we get propositional logic. Propositional logic is looking at the structure of language, structure of a sentence, then the arguments implicit and explicit within a sentence. And this is an art that's been lost. But when you look at the propositional logic, you realize that most of what people get from the Quran is interpretation, or applying their own meaning to it, or applying a particular, what would you say, a particular sense to it that's not necessarily present whatsoever in the actual words. So we maybe need to develop our skills at propositional logic to start to say, hold on, that's what it says, and anything beyond that is just guesswork.
But it's also a classic thing that you write a book that's incredibly vague, but then the leaders can superimpose on it whatever they like whenever they need to. That's a stroke of genius in itself, you know.
True, but then it's propaganda because it incites without explaining. It's unclear and it's evasive. Yet, you know, it's.
I think there was a guy in the 1940s that famously gave very ambiguous speeches to the German people. I wonder who that was. and everyone heard exactly what they wanted to hear. They took out the bits from it. They walked away with what they wanted to hear. You know, and that's how you do it. Incredibly vague, you know.
Right. Yeah. What do you think of this comment by PVD Guitars? Odon, Mel, what are your thoughts here?
I agree with Mahmoud, but I don't know about Uthman. Uthman is from Atman Sanskrit. I don't know. I don't know the linguistics.
Yeah, no, we're not too sure about Uthman, but I do want to point out something about the four rightly guided. There was a Jewish text.
Wrongly guided, Mel. Sorry, wrongly guided.
Yes. Well, there's actually in Jewish literature, there's a concept of the four craftsmen, and these are like when the Messianic, So when the Messianic time comes, there's meant to be four people: a prophet, a king Messiah, a priest Messiah, and a Joshua, who's a Joshua Messiah. But if you look at the four people that Islam, well, let's say we'll take the first three. I have it here. Let me just very quick if I can get it here handy.
I mean, so you can see the narrative parallels already, Mel. I mean, just from what you're saying, there are narrative parallels, and they try to make a narrative, a fiction out of these things.
Yeah. So let me just see if I can find it here very quick. Yeah. So Abu Bakr, right? He's often referred to as Sadiq. Now, Sadiq is a messianic title. It means the righteous one. It's a Hebrew word, just Arabized. And then you have Umar, who's called Al-Faruq, who's the savior. I don't know about Uthman, but Ali is the elevated one. And that has connotations of Moses. Moses is the elevated one because if you remember the story where his arms are lifted up, so that you also have Jesus saying, "When I'm lifted up from the earth," it's a messianic thing. It's deep in Jewish theology.
Interesting.
You know, so there you have all the footprints of messianism there. You know.
So then, I mean, would you guys then say, Mel, especially, I mean, you're new to this one, but would you say that JC's his reconstruction of trying to how the fictional narrative was created, do you think there's some merit here? Because I think there's a lot of merit to this.
Oh, there is definitely, yeah. The thing is, I think what JC is bringing is identifying the process. You don't have to get every detail correct here. It's the process that's the key thing. You can see what they're doing. They're taking stories. They're reusing them, they're reapplying them, they're changing elements, and then presenting something as if it was a revelation of some kind.
Yeah. Also, if you look at the previous history of the region, they have this whole ongoing. Well, before you had the Caliph, you had the Amr al-Muqmanin, and before the Amr al-Muqmanin, you had the Mukarraba, right? And that's where we get the word Makuraba and all that. But the whole point of the Makuraba was he had three roles. He was a warrior, priest, king. So he was the political leader. He had to make war, like do a jihad. And he also... welcome back, JC. And he had to make war. He was the emperor and he was the priest. So Muhammad fulfills those roles as well, which goes back historically to the pagan practice prior to him. So they're fulfilling this, and also they changed the word because I think they wanted to lose touch with the past, deliberately break that reference to the past. They didn't want people to pick up on what they were repeating.
Yeah, someone in the chat has put up the four horsemen of the apocalypse. That actually may have some connection with the Jewish literature in relation to the four craftsmen. These are people who play a role when the Messiah returns. So there's a lot more. And actually, why is it emphasized that Jesus was a carpenter as well? Because the Jewish tradition was expecting that the Messianic figures would be in some way craftsmen. That's argued by a guy called Mitchell in his book on Messiah ben Joseph. This is all relatively new to me.
What do you think of this comment by RVM Tube?
Well, this is...
it says Nur in dialect Maltese, derived from Nar, meaning fire, also the tongue of fire, i.e. the Holy Spirit, and also Nhar, meaning daylight.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So that would suggest the connection between the Messiah and the Holy Spirit. That would actually fit in with Jewish theology around the Shekinah. So where the Messiah is, there is the Holy Spirit, the presence of God. Even the exilarchs were believed to be the location of the Shekinah, the Holy Spirit, which is part of the reason why Jews prayed towards Jerusalem at one stage, was when the exilarchs were resident there, or the Jewish leaders.
Interesting.
It does feel a lot like he's looking at these things and saying, okay, so where did they actually steal this from? Because everything is borrowed. But so we have now these things. We're going to look in a minute. I'm going to try to actually bring the South into the picture. But first, we're going to have a look at one of these ancient Qurans.
I'll be right back.
Hello? Can you hear me?
I'll be right back.
Yeah.
One moment.
I can hear you.
Okay. So this is something that Muslims don't like, and that is the camel of God. Because they say, camel of God, well, that is not in the Quran, and it is perfectly preserved. Therefore, this St. John of Damascus was a fraud. And it's like, well, have a look at everything else on the screen. According to their own sources, everything was all over the place. Even a sheep ate some verses. So obviously, at one point, there was camel of God, and he's very descriptive about it. But this is as well what actually got my attention, and I missed it the first 10 readings of his work. And it's that John of Damascus first writes general stuff, and then he says, and by the way, about this book, and then he describes it, and then again, and then again. And he writes this. So in the book, the Haifa, there are some very stupid things, and it must be passed over. And I thought that he had stopped, but no, actually, he then describes a little bit of that book, because that is the pattern that he follows in all of the other things. So he says that in that book, men would be circumcised and women butchered, and also not about the Sabbath and not to baptism. So now we can add circumcision, Sabbath, and baptism to some of the verses that John of Damascus actually saw, and they are now gone. But interestingly enough, things like circumcision, that's actually not in the Quran, but it is in the traditions. So the line between the stuff that these leaders were saying, some of that stuff ended up being written and then became part of some of those pre-Quranic Qurans, and other stuff didn't. And then once there was one Quran, the other ones were removed. Well, people still remembered the things that they were made to do. And when we put those ones together, we're going to see what may have actually looked like. But would you agree with that the Quran would have been many versions with missing surahs, changes in surahs, and so on and so forth?
I fully agree. There was a selection process, but the thing is, when the Quran was not complete and was not recognized as God's word, it was not the Quran yet. It was something else. There were religious writings, maybe from a sort of divine inspiration or even revelation, but it was not considered as the Quran. So it's always a bit awkward to say that there was an Quran or a former Quran or different versions of the Quran, because there was no Quran at the time.
Yep.
There was no concept of Quran.
Yeah. Something else I would add is, like with the Bible, you need a genesis. You need an origin story somewhere in the Quran. And the nearest we get to something like that, and I'm sorry I forget the name of the surah, but there is a surah that refers to the messenger receiving a revelation from Gabriel, something to that effect.
Read in the name of your Lord.
Yeah.
Surah 96.
86 is great. So,
96.
96, okay. So, but the outside of the Quran, there is something that resembles a camel surah, the one that's missing, because you find in the Chinese sources an interesting tale about a camel herder who meets Husro and tells him to form an alliance with him, and that seems to parallel Nehemiah bin Huziel, who goes off with 20,000, they say, Jewish soldiers to conquer Jerusalem. You have that, and you also have Al-Tabari. And Al-Tabari gives us the name, the Arabic name of the person, Iyas ibn Kapisa, but also refers to the fact that he sacrificed a camel and gave it to Husro as part of the deal, and goes into more detail about the fact that there was an armament and weapons given to them and so forth. Now, that would be the origin story for the Arabs until the Abbasids took over. So I would hazard a guess that something like that story that made its way all the way to the Chinese in the 650s had to be got rid of. If that were ever in the Quran, it would have had to be got rid of and replaced by the Abbasids, because they want to tell a different story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the Abbasids that introduced Surah 96, in my view, with the story of a Mohammed that receives a revelation from Gabriel and all. To me, that's the new Genesis story for the Quran. And I think that's my take on it, because it's interesting that you have this strong tale. It's the one tale that the Arabs bring to the Chinese. And why is there no reference to it in the Quran? It's very curious. And yet it's still remembered by Al-Tabari, even centuries later. It's the big tale. And it's actually historically accurate, because it's the key event was the alliance between the Jews and the Persians to conquer Jerusalem, and everything after that rolled on from that key event. Without that event, none of what happened afterwards would have happened, in my opinion.
Well, lots of changes that happen. Actually, it would be great to have a conversation maybe later about some of the stuff. I have the feeling of how these stories were being put together, like in different regions. But actually, let's see what we can see here on the map to hopefully give an idea of how I'm seeing this. And again, this is just hypothesis, just sending things out there, because there are too many dots that they seem to be pointing in one direction, and to see if that actually helps the community find as well like some answers. First is that, well, up there, that was a region that was originally under the control of Muawiyah before the fight with Ali. And that region had, well, not only just a lot of history, but very good languages. You can write things down. The Arabic wouldn't actually make it up to that region until, well, Abdul Malik just makes it compulsory or starts the Arabization of particularly those areas, because their languages are very good. But Arabic would be those areas particularly. Then it begins to spread towards Iraq and then farther east. But that would be the area where, after the original conquest, they are starting to form stories. And I think not one heresy, but many, many heresies actually appear. And in the end, 2, 3, or 4, they start competing, and we still actually have 2 pretty much like to this day. But I think it's about the Arabic areas. The original tales would have been pretty much in Arabic, and when we take a closer look on that area, and this is what Lloyd was saying at the very, very start, the majority of the population in those regions would have been in Yemen. Also, lots of them in the Hijaz, and nothing in the desert areas. I mean, for example, when we think about ablution, that would need to actually originate either in the Hijaz or Yemen or a place like this, because if you're in the middle of the desert and you say, hey, I have this great idea, ablution, they will drive you out of the village with a stick. It wouldn't make sense. You need to have water in abundance. So that region, I think, is very, very important. And now when we try to put everything that we have discussed together, like pretty much, let's actually imagine what the Quran or pre-Quran that John of Damascus actually looked like. Well, we would recognize it if we had it with us. I think we would recognize it as Quran-ish, because it would have a lot of the stuff that we have actually read, but it also has that weird thing. It has a camel of God sort of thing. And then we would recognize that there are some verses about circumcision, and we would think, hang on a minute, that's in the Hadith. That's not in the book. It would say things about baptism and Sabbath, which probably would contradict other stories. But also, there will be verses in there that we recognize, but they are different. For example, the Quran that we have says God took Jesus to himself and said, Jesus, did you ask people to worship you and your mother as deities? But that's not what John of Damascus said. What he said in his version was God saying to Jesus, did you ask them to worship you as the Son of God and God? So now we have two different versions of exactly the same verse. In a different region, maybe they were telling the story as God asking Jesus, did you ask them to worship you as God? And that's it. There is the same almost blueprint of the story, but they are getting it wrong. Also, the story about Zayd, up there, what reaches the ears of John of Damascus is that Zayd was the friend of the false prophet, as opposed to the adopted son. In other areas could have been the brother. So the book would have been sort of ish, a little bit Quran, sort of, but very, very full of errors and mistakes. So I think that's what a book looked like back in those days before, they start removing them from print.
I'd have to respond to one thing on the previous slide. The assertion that Arabic wasn't up in the north is incorrect. There's Arabic inscriptions all the way back to, I think, 3rd, 4th century. Robert Kerr would totally disagree on this, and so would Al-Jalad, who's the inscription expert.
There was. I mean, if you go to Petra.
So if you can just finish the point, just to make it absolutely 100% on this, is that Aramaic was the dominant language, and then from the year 600 onwards, it started to descend and Arabic took over. So you're seeing it literally, and Greek was going out. So Arabic was mostly growing in Iraq, and that so the idea that it came up from the south is incorrect. I'm sorry. It was there, and that's why Arabic became the dominant language in the power centers. It doesn't make sense for what you're saying.
Okay, fair enough.
It's not. It does make sense, but it's not supported with the evidence on the ground, I'm afraid.
Okay, I know that the actual written Arabic was basically developed around 4th century in Syria, so there would have been the Arabic there, but once we get, I think, is the next slide, which is going to be
a point perhaps to make is that there was Yemeni Arabic, which was developed prior, because that was a written language. The weird thing is that everyone around Muhammad had written, there's something like, I think there's records of like 13 written languages around Muhammad. And then, of course, his tribe has no written language whatsoever. They're a bunch of illiterates, but everyone around them speaks everything from Greek to Russian to Eskimo, right? You can find inscriptions in like over a dozen languages all over the region, except for, of course, Momo's area where nobody can read and write, which makes them oddly unique because he was a trader, and then the traders around them were all literate, all wrote, all kept records. So there's a bit of an oddity. And then, as I said, the Yemeni Arabic was developed earlier than the Hijazi Arabic.
Yeah, and well, in the next slide, I'm just putting according to AI, like where the languages were pretty much like spoken, just to kind of give a visual aid. But what you have said about the Yemeni Arabic, this is actually something I think may be actually critically important. So, but this is actually within this slide. So yes, even Arabic was there, but you will see on the next slide like why I put it that way. Now, Yemen, we have the Sana palimpsest, which is full of errors. Now, there are many stories as to, well, maybe the bottom layer is this, maybe it's that. I think the bottom layer is simply whichever Quran, or in inverted commas, they had, wherever it was. If it is the actual script from Sana, then that original manuscript would have been in Sana. If it was in Yathrib, or in Oman. But as bad as it is, with the wrong order of surahs and with spelling errors, well, that would give us an actual very clear idea of what one of these pre-Quranic Qurans actually look like. Nothing to do with the, say, codices of the Sahaba. That thing never happened. But basically, one of those Qurans before somebody sat down and they put things together. So I think the Sana palimpsest would be something like this. The other thing that makes me think like about Yemen is, like I mentioned before, about ablution, because the Sabians, they actually they do ablution in exactly the same way, which of course one can argue they copied from the Muslims, but seeing as the Muslims have copied everything else from everybody else, I think is a reasonable assumption that maybe they copied from those guys. Maybe the prayers, which I don't know if they pray 5 times, I haven't actually found. That looks to me very Zoroastrian, but just putting that as a possibility. And the last point there, I didn't know this one until I found it in Odon's book, that Queen Zubaida supported the pilgrimage with, I think, aqueducts or some water reserves, right? And was that around the 8th century?
Is that a question?
Yes. Was it? I think Odon's
is the if I remember correctly, it was completed in 801. But that's according to Muslim history, which could of course be another niche standard Islamic narrative. It could be. I noticed that during the 16th century there was another aqueduct project that was someone's wife again, parallel. And it looks like it's actually, they backdated it back to the 8th century, even though I thought it could be reliable. It looks like it was in Ottoman times.
Right. So everything pretty much happened. Well, it wouldn't surprise me, and that's the thing. They really are like backdating everything. So I thought if that were the case, at least it would indicate that it could have been even by instruction of the Caliph. So it doesn't mean that the people in Yemen really are in control of the pilgrimage or anything of the sort, or even if it has any size. It could be the Caliph saying, you do it, and then that's that. But so those little things. Then we have the Topkapi manuscript, which of course is in Kufic script. It is much later, or a little bit later. It is full of errors, but it is pretty much complete. So that one would have been post-canonization and first canonization, or important one.
Kufic is Kufa, which means Iraq, right?
Yeah. And
Yemen would be technically it's South Arabian. It's not Arabic, but they had a fully developed language long before Hijazi Arabic came about.
Right. And that is, I think, the connection between those two. At least I would really like to speak with an expert who could
Why aren't
answer.
they in Hijazi Arabic? Well, why aren't they in Arabic? Well, why are they in Yemen and Baghdad and Turkey? I mean, it just kind of doesn't make sense, does it?
Well, yeah. And this is now where I think things get very interesting, or at least for me, that Leo III, well, both Leo III and John of Damascus, they don't mention Abdul Malik. And I would have thought maybe John of Damascus wouldn't mention the Caliph if he wanted to live. But Leo III, why wouldn't he say, hey, why did Abdul Malik create this book or commission that? He says that there are many falsifications, which there were, of course, but he actually gets to mention Al-Hajjaj by name. So out of all of the people who falsified this, Al-Hajjaj makes it to the ears of the king of or emperor of Byzantium. So Al-Hajjaj is the governor of that region right there, of Iraq. Probably a little bit more. I just actually did a blob in there. But what is as well interesting about this character is that, according to Yasser Qadi, the one and only, Al-Hajjaj was from Taif, assuming that the whole history has been recorded correctly and so on.
Been there, stayed overnight.
So his study was according to their traditions, a reciter, like he was one of the main guys in the city. So that story could be complete fabrication, or he could have been his father, one of the first guys that was in this heresy and making up stories. But very interestingly, in this conversation that Yasser Qadi has with some people, is he keeps saying, he says a number of times, I think if I remember correctly, that Al-Hajjaj really loved the Quran. He really, really loved the Quran. And there is no doubt he really loved the Quran. He keeps saying that. And I was looking at that thinking, yeah, you know stuff, don't you? I was thinking that. And also he says that Al-Hajjaj was a bit of a poet. So then we have this guy who was in Taif, and this is where I'm thinking about the story of Uthman. The story of Uthman is he's fighting in Syria. People are reciting the Quran incorrectly, and then he goes and canonizes the Quran. Well, if it is Al-Hajjaj who is in Syria and he hears stories that his daddy didn't tell him when he was a child and he was being put to sleep, like for example, he hears about the camel of God.
And if you can't remember the verse, replace it with poetry.
Exactly. Make it sound nice. If it sounds nice, then that is what matters. So if the story of Uthman is Al-Hajjaj and he hears stories like Camel of God or whatever, and he thinks, no, hang on a minute, these are not the stories my daddy used to tell me, he would be the one that would come back to his land in Iraq and say, okay, we have to sort this out. I want the story that my daddy told me. And in order to then do that, I think he would need to send someone out, someone that would go down in history as Ibn Thabit, who said, by Allah, if they had asked me to shift one of the mountains, it would not have been heavier of a load than this ordering me to put together the Quran. It looks like it was a little bit hard. But this is where things get, I think, very, very interesting. So Thomas Alexander, I really like the stuff from this guy, and some things I will say, that would require a bit of a conversation. But there is in one of his 3-minute video, he explains about a problem with the Yemeni script, particularly with the word Abraham and Shaitan. And long story short, although it is a 3-minute video, he explains that very well, is that in the script from Yemen, they would have written something that read Satan. But in order to pronounce it properly, they would have to add a tick. That was part of their writing conventions. So somebody in Yemen would read that and say, oh, it says Satan. But if you take that out of that region, wherever it is that they have that writing convention, when they looked at that rasam, they wouldn't be able to read it properly because they would see an extra tick. That tick would be a consonant. They would think it's a consonant. And what in the south they call it Satan, in the north they would say, okay, that is a ya, that is a ta, that is a nun, that is another letter. And they went with Shaitan because they misread the script from the south. The thing is, and actually I put these ones in the other direction. So I will just say this one first. And I learned this just the other day. I was unaware that Abraham is spelled in 2 different ways in the Quran. That was actually shocking. I didn't know. They have 2 different spelling, and one of them, based on the very little that I know about this, seems to be the spelling from that south, from Yemen, the one where you would have the ya, which it's not read in Yemen, but if it was taken to the north, would then become a consonant. So what I'm thinking is whether everything started from the north, it really went to the south, and yes, there would be people speaking languages in all over. Oh, actually, let me do one more slide, and then that's pretty much like almost it. By the way, also in their traditions, they keep saying about the Yemeni corner, like a lot.
Yeah, well, he says in the south, it's Abraham or Ibrahim, and it becomes Ibrahim because they misread that little tick. And Satan becomes Shaitan because of the way that they mistook the tick in the north, right? With the Arabic, with the Yemeni Arabic versus the Yemeni script versus the Hijazi script.
Yes, so between Sa and Sha is just the dots, so nobody cares. But then they would have the little tick that in the north they say, okay, that's a ya. Mm-hmm. And in the south it's like, no, it's just an elongated vowel, man. Don't read it, just remove it. So basically that, which I find it quite compelling.
So
but
it should have been Abraham, more like we would say it in English, and Satan, and they took away the elongated A, and they said Shaitan, and Ibrahim. So they changed it. So there was so the source was Yemeni originally.
I have massive issues with it's a bit tenditious argument here, but Abraham is the Aramaic version, and it's also similar in Hebrew. And Surah 2 is predominantly in that spelling. Ibrahim is the Arabized version of it. The Shaitan, I think, is the if I remember correctly, I think you find a spell like that in the Ethiopic Bible, I believe, if my memory serves me right.
Yeah.
But the idea of mistaking the lettering, I don't think that's even feasible, because these are not just any old words. These are very familiar terms with a very long history in the culture. So I don't think it's that. It has to be. I think it's got to do with the fact that there's an Arabization going on from Aramaic, and they're distancing themselves from the Aramaic towards a more Arabic, even to the point of maybe even making it sound distinctive and different.
Actually, the Americans did that. That's why they say faucet instead of tap, elevator instead of lift, apartment instead of flat, because we want to be different, right?
Yeah, but like in like, just to give you another example, you have al, like al whatever, al Hajjaj, but actually in Malta they use il. So the early migrants that came from the Maghreb and from Spain, in their form of Arabic, it was strongly Aramaic as well as Arabic, and so there were weird changes in words and sounds, so it's I don't know where all this is going, but I'd be careful with jumping to conclusions on this. I think we need much stronger evidence, and I think this is tenditious arguing. We really need to be careful, because it's prone to error, and I've been there, I've done it. So I think we need stronger arguments if we're going to, for the Yemeni. I'm not disputing that there's a Yemeni connection, but we got to be careful here.
We're assuming these Muslims, guys, we're Muslims. We're going to have very strong arguments, because one day Mal's going to look at this and we need to be logical, factual, and precise. No, these were a bunch of idiots who were making stuff up. Who, how to say, how mistakes happen? They must be carelessly planned. And these guys were all about the careless planning. So we might be giving them a little too much credit.
So these things.
Sorry.
Yes, that I'm trying not to say jump to conclusions, but actually put questions. And in fact, in a minute, there's going to be look, some questions like, could this thing be like this and be like that? In the hope that those, because if you don't ask the right question, you can never get the right answer. So the first place is like, hey, could this be? And when the answer is no, it's like, okay, fine. So how about this? How about this? But it's about getting into that and says, is there any merit on this, or how to explore further? From this thing, from Thomas Alexander, I'd say when I'll find that particular video, it's like 3 minutes. And he did say, I think on that video, that there was some merit on the whole adding extra consonants in the script in the South, but this is not my area of expertise by a long.
You might explain it. It wasn't about consonants. It was about extending the A and contracting the A. But I think that was what his video was about, because it made sense to me. If I can just throw this in for a minute. This is from a native Israeli Jewish speaker. He spoke about al and il, because you just mentioned il. He says the term al-Rahman, for instance, has parallels in Hebrew. The Hebrew vowel system allows this to be read as el or al, which is the Arabic style. So you have el-al, it means God, and Rahman means merciful. But this exact term appears in Yemeni Jewish liturgy, specifically in the Birkat HaAvot, the opening blessing of the prayer, right? So the term appears in Jewish prayers with identical spelling. So there's an overlap. This suggests a shared Semitic linguistic heritage and potential cross-cultural influence between the Hebrew and the Yemeni, which obviously bleeds into the Arabic because you get the al, although that's actually shared across the Yemeni and the Hebrew. So just an interesting point. I thought that this guy mentioned it today.
I've got something here from what's his name, Syed Reynolds, a paper here, and it's basically saying that the Ethiopic Shaitan in the Ethiopic Bible precedes the Quran. The Ethiopic Bible was done in the 6th century. So I think that's just, that word would have circulated as a result of being in the Ethiopic Bible. So
long before,
it would have spread all over the place. So wherever Ethiopic missionaries went, they would have used that word as opposed to the Aramaic word, you know.
Fair point.
Great. Because actually one of the things that Lloyd said at the beginning, he said something about Ethiopia. So, and I thought, okay, well, we'll get there. So this is very, very brief, like a top 5 foreign words in the Quran, apart from all of the Arabic, of course, so the foreign ones. So on the map, this is actually just from AI. So if any of them, they're actually not in the correct area or something like this, hopefully they are on the ballpark. So we have first Hebrew and Greek. Well, we still use lots of words that come from Greek, particularly, very important language. So we'd expect the Quran or any book to actually have a lot of Greek. Hebrew, well, the Abrahamic stories, of course, they would have a lot of Hebrew. Those wouldn't surprise me. Then when we get to Aramaic and Syriac, then we have all of those things in the north. And we know that the almost skeleton of much of the Quran was actually Syrio-Aramaic, so that would make sense. But then the one that really stands out happened to be Ethiopic, because there is that kind of like huge gap. Unless those people were speaking that language even in Egypt or something like that, I'm looking at this map and thinking if there was that gap, it's almost as if, what would you do if you find a lot of Japanese in the Quran? You would think that they needed to have had any sort of like connection, particularly when it's actually the top 5 on the 5th spot. The other ones make sense because everything would originate from there, but it looks like Ethiopic comes in at one point. And like I think I mentioned as well before, if we find things that happen to have been copied from the Ethiopic Bible, it's like, okay, great. So now we know where the Ethiopic actually comes from. It's because these books, they just copy-pasted. But if that is not the case, it may have been of how people were actually writing things. Just by looking at this map, and I know that there will be some things that are not exactly in place, but I hope they are on the ballpark. And the South, I feel like at one point the South may have kicked in, also because of the...
Well, the Yemenis were a major empire from about 800 BC, it could be 1000 BC, up until about I mean, they rose and fell a few times. They were predominant, and they fell and they rose. But they owned most of that region up towards the Egyptian border there, from Ethiopia all the way up towards Egypt. Then at some point they fell and the Ethiopians invaded, and the Ethiopians controlled most of that region again, including most of Arabia, Central Arabia certainly, and they also traveled and traded. So the Aksumite Empire was at one point the 4th most powerful empire in the world after Rome and Greece and one other, I can't remember which. So they were extremely powerful and influential at one point.
The language of commerce is hugely influential in any period. If you think of Ethiopia at that time, they were the big traders in that area. You know, it's a myth that the Arabs were the big traders. They weren't. The Ethiopians controlled most of the shipping trade that went up and down. And wherever they met people, they were talking, you know, to them, and words transmitted. So if you imagine you have Ethiopic traders and they are using an Ethiopic Bible with the word shaitan, that word is going to be transmitted. Also, you have another thing in Yemen. You have very strong Jewish community down in Yemen. And obviously they're conversing with those in the north. The words are being transmitted northwards and also from the north-south. So there's a big interchange between both sides, you know. So it doesn't. It's no surprise then you have this big mishmash of vocabulary in the Quran. That reflects very much the nature of the environment, you know.
Cool.
Agreed.
So very last slide, which is some questions, or rather, is like, what do you guys think about this? Well, the first one, I think now you have told me what you are thinking about the Petra thesis. So I wanted to kind of put that word out there, that question. It doesn't really change anything, which is, well, if these guys were praying in a given direction, Could it be because they actually own that place? They actually started from that place, as opposed to not being, saying, in control of Petra, but then starting to have their Qibla walls facing in that direction. I could argue both ways. If they were not going to pray towards Jerusalem, then they don't have many other options. If it's a city, it's Petra, or perhaps the sun, or whatever it may be. But yes, wondering, if it was me, I would certainly get, say, people to pray in the direction of my city. I don't know, kind of random. Any thoughts?
Makes sense. You have allegiance somehow, but yeah, there's a link.
Yep.
Clear link.
Next one, very, very silly, which is the Muhammad, if it is attached to building the third temple. I just wonder if these people actually thought that whoever does that, God will grant him superpowers, because there are all of these weird things in the traditions where people kind of like go to Mohammed thinking that he's going to do something miraculous, and nothing happens. He's like a letdown. So nothing that changes the history in any way. But I wonder if people thought, oh yeah, we have the Muhammad, maybe that guy can heal you, and they go and nothing happens.
No, but if he does heal people he actually does provide healing in some of the hadiths. But also, if you go into the Sirah, he heals the sick, he heals the blind, he spits on his hand, and then he wipes it over someone's eyes. I wonder where he got that idea. It could be something in the New Testament.
Wow, never heard
He
of
also
that
creates
story.
food.
He makes water come from his hands. He makes 1,000 people drink from a small cup. And also, he hits a rock once, and the rock, huge rock, bigger than him, like a massive rock. He hits it once with a spade, and it turns into sand.
What a guy. He never existed, though. Now, when putting together the Quran, this thing about the writing conventions that we've discussed, whether there would be an influence, the chances are there would have been influences from all over, but a lot to unpick. This one now really bothered me is, when you have, Christianity, you follow Christ, and Buddhists follow Buddha, but then you get to Islam and you have surrender and you have submission. And of course, Muslims say, yeah, that's, submit to Allah. And it's like, well, absolutely, that's not how it works. They have two very, very violent words that actually describes them, which now they have almost repurposed. And the translations, by the way, I think I got them from the Christian Prince shouting at some Muslims. So if that's actually what they mean, it almost feels like these guys were going around telling to people, well, surrender and submit to me. And those things almost like stuck. The whole thing about submission to God, I'm just not buying it. It feels very warlike wars to me.
Yeah. Your third point about Yemen, South Arabian, like the official language of that part of the world, those inscriptions, complete, full, like tablets and inscriptions as a written language, dates easily back to 1000 BC in written format, right? Whereas Hijazi Arabic appears 300, 400 AD. So Yemen, Arabia, Southern Arabia had a highly developed language over 1,000 years, well over 1,000 years before Hijazi Arabic. They had full texts. And in fact, you can find graffiti in Hebrew, Greek, and a whole bunch of languages, that existed in that region long before Hijazi Arabic came about.
Well, I'll just jump in there about the idea of building the third temple. I suppose the key thing there with building the temple, that is very much a Jewish thing, and you need a Messiah for the temple to be built. There is records of not quite a temple, but like a substitute for a temple in the 7th century being built on a much smaller scale. There's contemporary references to the renewal of making sacrifices on the Temple Mount, at least for a certain short period, and then it stopped again. So I think that probably deserves more consideration. I think whenever Islamic tradition refers to people making sacrifices, from a Jewish perspective, the only place you can make animal sacrifices is on the Temple Mount, otherwise it's considered a sin. I think that again points to Jerusalem as being a key location,
Cool. And actually, the last thing
I also want to jump in just on the surrender, Islam as a name for the religion. It's very convenient, of course, for the caliphs and the warlords to have a religion that calls for submission to God, paralleling the submission to political authority. But there is also a thing, the fabrication of Islam was also constrained by the meaning of the Quran. And in the Quran, there is a verse that says, I have completed my religion for you, and I agree Islam as my religion for you. And because of this, it was convenient to call the religion Islam. Because of the Quran, actually. It's a bit like the name Mecca. Because the name Mecca is in the Quran, let's call the city Mecca.
Actually, it says Baka in the
yes.
Quran, doesn't it? It says Baka.
Yeah, there are two occurrences. There is one Becca and one Mecca in Surah 48. But it's not very clear whether it's Mecca or whether it meant something else.
Yeah, it's very vague. It's incredibly vague.
It can mean something else also. It doesn't.
Yeah, we discussed it. And it's extremely vague. It's hard to really get a sense of it. And Muhammad has no connection to Mecca whatsoever.
And they had other words like as well Sharia, so that one appears only one, and now how important it is. And which one is the other one? Well, Caliph as well, that Abdul Malik took, and then the others in the Abbasids. They appear. There are words that appear once in the Quran and says, yeah, it's all about this. So it feels like they were trying to build everything based on what it says there. Mm-hmm. It's just that looking at those words is like, why didn't you just call it like Mohammedism or whatever it is if you're going to follow a Muhammad?
But it was long known as Mohammedanism. That was how people knew it for centuries, and it's only like in the 20th century, the last 50 years, that they started marketing it as Islam. It was Mohammedanism forever.
And actually, if you replace that word with Mahmed, which is a synonym for Messiah, what do you have? It's basically a religion that's messianic. It's messianism, essentially.
Oh, it's another name for Christianity.
But it's warlike messianism, because remember the Yemeni king was convert to Judaism or die, which is a little bit Islamic, Well,
what's interesting, actually, say a few centuries into the beginnings of Islam, the messianic side seemed to just dip and just kind of disappear, and you can tell that from the absence of messianic titles among the caliphs. And then come the Ottomans, almost all of them have messianic titles in their names all the way through, right into the 20th century. So there's a big resurgence there. That suggests that they're relearning their Jewish connections because they're coming into contact with Jews again, and they're interacting, and they're learning more about their origins, as it were. I think that side of things is kind of overlooked a bit.
Yeah, and and just the very, very last thought that I had is, well, according to their own traditions, it says that, well, they thought first the book is uncreated, and then it is created during their Inquisition, and then again uncreated. And it's like, no, hang on a minute, but the whole story about Islam was cooking for a really long period of time. People didn't really believe en masse that it was uncreated. They thought it was special, but not uncreated. So it goes from uncreated, created, uncreated again. So it feels a little bit weird. I wonder if the actual Mihna, their Inquisition in the early 9th century, was when the heresy had split basically into two major factions. One that believes the book is basically what we read. It's all about Jesus, and they thought, stories from the past, all a bit of fun, Moses, Jesus, this sort of thing. But they don't really think that book is anything other than some collections of stories. And then you have the other group, and they are the ones that have been radicalized, the ones that they have been now brainwashed with the standard Islamic narrative, which they are already creating. And you're having these two factions fighting. Hey, the book is not uncreated, it's just a book. The other one, it is uncreated. And then they fight, and the insane takes over the asylum, and here we are. Just a thought whether that could be the marker of when what we would call maybe radicals, or people who really believe in this very standard Islamic narrative, they really only took power at that point, because before that everybody was like, yeah, it's just a book, it's all good, don't worry. I don't know, just a thought. And that's me, by the way. If you would like to, just please help me remove this, or we'll just do it directly.
I don't worry about it. No.
Okay. So that's me done.
Right. You guys are more expert than I am on this particular topic, so I mean, it's something you do more of, so I'll leave you guys to comment.
To be frank, JC, I was more convinced and more enthusiastic with your previous presentation, where the patterns you put forth, I think really made sense. Here, it's the ground is not that solid.
Yeah, but then neither is the sin, right? I mean, these guys could have been reaching for straws.
What do you say?
No, think about it. The sin is not very solid either. So these guys were reaching for straws because, I mean, we know the sin is also not very solid. So they might have run out of material. So now they were sort of like scattered and grabbing things as things were unfolding.
It's not a matter of solidity, of sin solidity. It's a matter of recognizing patterns within the sin, patterns, story patterns, and you made some very interesting points about Salman al-Farisi, for example. And here it's also interesting, but it's not as conclusive.
Yeah, I would agree there. I think there's a danger. You can certainly make arguments about where stories come from, but then the danger is then to use that as evidence for the history side of things, and that's where I think there's problems. I think the Yemeni argument, I'm not convinced by. I know Lloyd has got a lot of evidence, and there is some evidence there, but I think the major hole in the argument is if it all was written down there, they should have used the Sabiaic language and with a Sabiaic script, and they would have no problems with diacritical marks. Job done. It was there for the language and script was there for at least 1,000 years.
No, I mean, I never said it was written there, but I think the influence is from there, because it seems to be it was written out in Tajikistan for all we know, right, at this point.
Yeah.
So for some odd reason. But there's certainly these southern influences that are generally dismissed or unaccounted for.
Yeah, I think the influences are there. I would agree with that side of things, but it's kind of understandable because of the nature of trade and movement, and with missionaries going up and down. I think there's a danger to jump the gun a bit too much, because I think we don't appreciate the level at which communication and trade and travel was going on.
True, but some of the pagan stuff. I spoke about trade in monotheism, but for instance, there's certain hadiths, right? Certain traditions where there's these little dangling clues that just go nowhere. These little dangling threads. Like, for instance, he says the religion is from Yemen. It's pretty random. Why say that and then just leave it dangling? You know, it's kind of like, okay, what if it is? Well, what if that was something they forgot to expunge, right? Or they removed all the details, but what if it was from Yemen? Then what if the basis of it, all that paganism, well, there's the source, right? And then everything else just gets built on top because they got to modernize or whatever.
Yeah.
Problem that what I wanted just to make clear as well, that I was not really trying in any way to reach to the conclusions of, oh, look, everything actually happens here, but rather asking the what if this is like this. Things like, for example, like with the ablution, like somebody actually comes up with that. And if that happened in Jerusalem and they actually brought it with them, that's fine. But the Sabians are doing it, so that could actually point us in that direction. It didn't mean that they would do it everywhere, but there wasn't one guy walking around saying, okay, you guys are going to do this from this point on. So say, for example, that the original Mohammed was, just for argument's sake, Umar and Ali, because those two are mentioned by Leo III. And those guys are the ones that are just these guys are warlords. They're going around and they're saying things. At the same time, they have their people going around telling stories and all of that. Somehow, a while later, people have been writing some of that stuff, and they would have written the stories. Some of them, maybe they actually had them from the Judeo-Nazarenes, like actual copies with them. Others, they're actually just, hey, do you know what the caliph or king or whatever, he said this? Do you know what happened with his wives? Look, they are gossiping. They are saying lots of things. But in every single village is probably going to be different, because that thing, for example, that the Quran says, "O Prophet of Allah, if you divorce your wives, maybe Allah would give you better wives and then virgins and everything." Is like, what is that doing in my religious text? That why is there? That wouldn't have happened like in every single city, but it is a story that would be in one place and then it spreads. So can be Yathrib, and then from there it expands. But when we look at as well the amounts of people in those regions, if you a very, very cool story appeared in the middle of the desert when you were in a village, that story would die out. It wouldn't really spread. But if you are certainly in the Hijaz and possibly even in Yemen, I think there are lots of people, they would communicate those stories. Also, if, say, it is Umar or Ali, they say, okay, so from now on, you are going to circumcise. That those people are going to start doing it en masse because now they have been ordered. 80 years later, that becomes, well, the Mohammed actually told us, and they start changing the story. But if one instruction was given to a very small group of people, that would just die out. The way of different cultures, different traditions, practices, going together into one, there wasn't one guy who told them this is how you act. A lot of it is those people were already doing it in whichever region they were, and through the expansion, they kind of convinced the whole of the empire of how to do it, as opposed to one guy saying, no, this is exactly how you do it. So I think it's more likely that ablution, for instance, was already being done by a group, and then they said, the king told us to do it this way, as opposed to a guy going there and micromanaging.
The Sabians are doing it. The Sabians are doing an ablution ritual. I mean, baptism was adapted to become ablution.
Jews were doing ablutions, and still do.
So that could very well have been taken directly from the very first Hijra or Exodus.
I think there's two other issues as well. To my knowledge, all the Hadith collections, none of them were written in Arabia or Yemen. They were written in places like Iran and greater Iran. So that's one problem. And then secondly, as Jay Smith has been discovering, all of these attributed Hadith collections, the ones that they say are 8th century, 9th century, they're literally centuries centuries younger than we thought. Like it's even the earliest are talking 3 or 4 centuries after the time. So if they're geographically distant, and they're also distant in time from the events, and the fact that they're making stuff up, they're absolutely useless. They're of no use to us apart from sort of acknowledging their genius at stitching things together. But I think it's very tenuous, the conclusions you can draw from something that's essentially fictional. That's what I'd be cautious about. You can trace some elements, but I think you can't really draw too strong a conclusion from that.
I think it's good food for thought, and it gives you a hypothesis to test your theories against. It allows you to line up ideas, eliminate the ones that you don't think match the known facts, and it allows you to figure out what stands, what falls. I think it's still a good exercise. I mean, I've got some papers that I want to do with it, maybe if you guys are both available, but Odon and I spoke. I've got some new evidence, dates back 50, some of it 50 years, some less, to the 60s in some cases, of the presence of Christianity in Arabia, which was denied. I mean, there were no Jews there, but now we know that Judaism at one point may well have been the predominant religion, which means it was everywhere and everyone knew about it. So that domino falls. And then, of course, Christianity in Arabia, that needs better investigation. I've got a couple of papers on that are worth investigating, because that also tells us, because remember, they denied Christianity because Islam came out of nowhere, right?
Yeah.
That's my final take on that. So,
Okay.
yeah. So it's been 2.5 hours. I have school tomorrow. Don't know about the rest of you guys.
Yeah,
Well,
I do work.
we have managed to take a little bit of liberty because of when Mel joined, and then we said, okay, so an hour from there, when I say we said, I said. So thank you very much,
Mel's
actually,
fault.
Lloyd, for
I
being
blame
so
Mel.
accommodating.
I blame Mel.
Sorry, guys. Sorry.
It was
No,
the
but
clock.
it's great. I mean, it's a really great exercise. It's really great to think about it because Islam is a narrative. How did the narrative begin? What are the
Yeah.
what are the influences that created this narrative?
Yeah.
And well, Odon,
I mean-
seeing as you liked how I actually unpicked the previous things, there were quite a few things that we didn't discuss. They actually removed from the whole thing as the parallels of Abdul Malik. So maybe that's a conversation that we will have at one point. And
Well, let's talk about that.
hopefully you will like
Christmas Day. I'm not doing much. Just kidding.
Yeah. As Mel put it, it's very, very difficult to analyze the Hadith. And there is also, in the fabrication of the narrative, there is a sort of, there were many steps. You see, I think the Umayyads started to forge their own narrative. And thereafter came the Abbasids, who had to make do with the Umayyad narrative, but they changed it, and they forged their own narrative. And thereafter came others, and so on and so on. And
Comes
in
like
the
Chinese
end, it's
whispers,
very,
you know.
very hard to see clearly. We
Well,
have
then they had
clues,
to
we have,
merge. They had to merge those narratives somehow, and the whole thing just becomes pick and mix, right?
And the thing is, the narratives have an ideological what's the word?
Agenda.
Agenda. So you can't discount that. So nothing is straightforward. And sometimes what's happening is, what are they getting you to look away from? That's the real agenda. What do they not want you to focus on? So that is actually more, for me, that's more interesting than what they're actually getting you to focus on. Because if they don't want you to know that Islam began in to do with Jerusalem and the Messiah, then they're going to do everything in the Hadiths to send you down to Mecca and anywhere else, anywhere other than Jerusalem. You know, that's the thing. And also they're very critical that you interpret the Quran that the way they want you to interpret it. Even non-Muslims interpret it the way they want you to interpret it, because they're putting everything in those square brackets, as well as having the seerah and all the rest.
Murad's translation has some merit here, because I think he's using basic propositional logic. He's not reading what is not in the words. He's saying, this is what the words say. This is not an interpretation or an extension or my eisegesis. This is what it says. You cannot get to there from here with these words.
That's good, because without that, like we without a proper translation, we're just simply guessing. We don't actually know what the text is saying, because we have this lens that we're forced to look through by the translation. You know, so thankfully we've got rid of that lens, so we're one step closer.
Yeah, well, and also the Quran was actually finalized in 1985, so now they cannot move the goalpost anymore. So maybe now we can make progress at long last.
No, I think we are. I mean, like Odon said, your first presentation, that was really, I mean, that had me thinking. This one, I mean, there was some great discussion around this. It excited a lot of great discussion. So it gives you a framework to test ideas with, and I think it's still worth it for that purpose. And I think there's some merit. I mean, I personally, as I've said, the southern aspect, the influence from Yemen, that is not really well considered. It's discarded by scholars. And I mean, there's one scholar that was writing. It could have been Jeffries, who said that scholars have just overlooked this whole part of the history and influence.
Just to respond to Sheikh Boudardi, I'm no longer. The YouTube has switched off the automatic mirroring onto other channels, and I don't have the time to post videos on multiple channels. So sorry about that. It's just on YouTube.
Yeah, the thing is, I'm multi-streaming to Twitter, to Twitch, sorry, to X, and to the other site that starts with an R.
Rumble.
So I'm multi-streaming to all three right now. That's what I do. It's just I can't keep up with anything else. I'm not interested in Facebook. So yeah, that's it, guys. That's it from me. Any final words, guys? Because but this has been great. I really enjoyed it.
Well, for me, thank you all for watching, and I'm sorry that I kept you all like this long, but at least for the first time ever, we managed to actually get through all of the slides. So yay, that was a win.
Yeah, I thought it was a very productive discussion. Hopefully, I wasn't too critical, but that's what I do, and But I thought it was a great step forward in terms of analyzing the hadiths and seeing how they're constructed. So well done.
Yeah.
Agreed. A very interesting discussion to be redone later.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And hopefully
Let's
Odon and
do
I
it
can
again.
do at least one episode next week, because you're going to do the Jerusalem thesis, right, Odon? When shall we
Yes,
do that?
I have this Jerusalem thesis in my
How's
computer.
Friday?
I'll do this.
How's Friday?
Mel,
Well, if you guys are
you
free, we can maybe
know-
all jump in. I mean, is Friday okay for you, Odon?
next Friday?
This Friday.
Not this Friday, but Friday next week maybe. Let me
Okay.
just check.
Let me just
Yeah.
Friday next week I can't make, unfortunately.
Wednesday?
Wednesday next week I can do.
So if you're free next
Wednesday.
Wednesday, Odon?
Yeah, okay with me.
Okay, then we can do Wednesday. Then if JC wants to jump in, we can all consider and go through it. The Jerusalem thesis would be a great parallel with this now as well, to see, you know. Okay, that sounds good. That's a plan.
That's a plan.
Phenomenal.
All right.
I love it when a plan
All right.
comes together.
Awesome. Good to see you again, Mel. It's been a while. Good to have you back in the saddle. All right. Yeah. A-team all the way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I won't say who is who in the A-team here, but take your pick.
Yeah, look, like Odon always says, it's a great team except for Lloyd. So guys, yeah, I think we'll call it a night here then, and we'll be in touch. All right.
Cheers.
Everyone, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
It's been great. God bless everyone.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.